I'm ready.
Good evening, everyone. I will call the semi-monthly meeting of the Rhode Island Cultural Resources Management Council to order. Today is Tuesday, December 12, 2023. I would ask that the record reflect the council members that are in attendance, as well as CRMC staff members that are present. Our first matter on the agenda will be approval of the minutes of the previous meeting, that being November 28, 2023. I know they were disseminated. Is there a motion from the council?
Move to approve the minutes.
Motion made by Mr. Izzy, is there a second? Second by Mr. Gagnon, any discussion? If none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Let the record reflect that. Please. Subcommittee report, Mr. Willis.
There are no subcommittee reports tonight, Mr. Chair.
Staff reports.
Yes, Mr. Chair, there's a couple items I just want to talk to the council about briefly. Last week, I think I've mentioned to you in the past, last week I sat for the CRMC on the Legislative Cohog Commission. The Cohog Commission is looking at the nutrients and nitrogen loading to Narragansett Bay and the potential link to Cohog production. And they're looking at ways for the free and common to have more productivity. And there may be a link with the amount of nitrogen that is removed from the system, according to the fishermen. So we've been meeting as a commission pretty much monthly, trying to digest all the science in terms of what's being done on Narragansett Bay to address that situation. As we meet, I will bring you more up to speed on that. But we did get a very good tour of the Narragansett Bay Commission's facility last week, and got a very good understanding of how wastewater is treated and how nutrients and nitrogen are removed from the system there. You'll notice two council members are not here, but are trying to be here because of traffic with the 195 bridge. And hopefully they'll be able to make it in time, but if not, we have a plan. That said, I have reached out to the DOT senior staff, in particular the deputy director, and let the deputy director at DOT know that because of the 195 project and the probability that any work that's going to have to be done on the bridge will be in CRMC jurisdiction and they don't need a permit, that CRMC is ready and able to help them in any way possible. But knowing that they need to figure things out first, I just wanted to let them know that we're ready and able. So that's where we're at with that. That's my report, Mr. Sean.
This is our first matter on the agenda is the federal consistency before the council for review and action. Bearing the number 2022-03-080 SouthCoast Wind Energy LLC. It's an offshore wind renewable energy export cable corridor in federal waters. Thank you, Mr. Willis. Are you going to report on this?
I have to, sorry to interrupt, but if I may,
I'm sorry.
you have to give this to Walker just when you're accusing from this matter due to potential conflict with another client. For the new council members, we have Deputy Legal Counsel John Longo here, who's actually been with the agency for much longer than Tony, for about 15 years, being in very good hands. And with that, I'll stand back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I first want to let everybody know that normally Kevin Sloan, our cultural policy analyst, who is primarily handling as one of his major duties at CRMC, all these offshore wind farm federal consistency reviews, was not able to make the meeting tonight. He has a family matter that he has to attend to. So I am in his place going to go over the SouthCoast and federal consistency review that he has primarily done for us, along with Justin, myself, Laura, and some other staff. So bear with me. I have a number of matters that I want to put on the record and introduce the issue of federal consistency and how it applies to the CRMC under the CZMA, which is the Federal Coastal Management Act. And I will end with our staff recommendation to the consistency certification that the applicants here for who will then present after me, or after you have any questions.
Thank you.
So as you know, the FAB, the Fishermen's Advisory Board, as constituted at the beginning of this review for this particular project, resigned. The lack of a FAB, however, or FAB involvement doesn't preclude the CRMC from conducting a federal consistency review for this project. FABs are an important component of our offshore wind project review process. A meeting between the FAB and the developer was held and was considered necessary data and information under 15 CFR 930 subparts D and E, and also in the notion sample at section 11.10.1D. So therefore, the necessary data and information to begin the federal consistency review process was met because the developer met with the FAB at that time. As I'll explain later, this process didn't begin a few weeks or months ago. It began about 2 years ago, prior to the FAB resigning. Additionally, the lack of a power purchase agreement does not preclude a state's COPA program from conducting its federal consistency review under the CRMC. Because BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is able to develop an environmental impact statement regardless of PPAs, and the state's federal consistency review is not concerned with the project's financial viability. So when a PPA is in place, BOEM gives great deference to the project's PPA in BOEM's purpose and needs analysis. When a project does not have a PPA, BOEM still can allow the project to go forward when BOEM is determined whether a project is currently being reviewed as part of the state solicitation, or whether the project plans to compete for an award during an EIS development. That has occurred. Therefore, regardless of whether a project has secured PPAs, an environmental analysis can be conducted by BOEM under NEPA, which then, under federal allowances, we can reasonably rely on that information for our federal consistency review. As to the state's federal consistency review process, we are not concerned whether the project has financial viability. The CZMA's federal consistency review is considered reasonably foreseeable impacts to a state's total resources and uses against the state's important policy. Our review process is not concerned with the purpose and need because that's addressed by BOEM. So just wanted to make that distinction. What's the scope of a CZMA review? Well, I think you all know this is the 3, 4, 5. This is the 6th project that's done in front of you all since the very first one in your room. And this project is in front of you because of our 2 geographic location descriptors, one that we did in 2011, one that we did in 2018. Those 2 dates are important because that's when the federal government approved our application for those DODs. And because that federal approval exists, certain activities are presumed to have an impact on Rhode Island's coastal resources. Offshore wind is one of them. Cables are one of them, in addition to many others. So therefore, we have a review authority for offshore wind and against our enforcement policies. So as we're doing tonight, we're here to determine whether an activity is consistent with the state COPA program. And we do that by underneath the federal consistency review process. The process takes place within a larger primary federal permitting scheme. BOEM, as the lead federal agency, coordinates its reviews and requirements with other federal agencies and issues a final decision, including COP, Construction Operation Plan approval, and issuance of the ROD. As part of that federal process, certain consultations between federal cooperating agencies such as NIMS and Marine Fisheries Service are either ongoing or have been completed and will result in additional mitigation measures, final design and engineering layout decisions, construction, operation, and decommissioning information, regardless of what we've done. The vast majority of these federal actions, however, will be finalized after our federal consistency review process. So the state's not privy to those federal conversations between the federal agencies, so we're not able to gather that information and include it in parts of our review. However, what I do want everybody to know is that when a state's consistency decision is made, it's important to note that it's not the final decision in whether a project can go forward. That will ultimately rest with BOEM. And then another point I do want to make is that our consistency decision is not a regulatory action by the state. Our consistency decision is part of a review criteria because we cannot regulate activities outside of our jurisdiction, but we can review these activities when we're authorized to, and we are because of the GLD, as an enforceable tool to help avoid, minimize, mitigate for those impacts. There are several possible decision outcomes for a federal consistency review. The state may issue a concurrence, which the project as proposed is found to meet the state's enforceable policies and just can proceed as planned. It could have, a state can issue a concurrence with conditions, which is a project as proposed does not, in the state's opinion, meet the enforceable policies, but after the state and the developer have mutually agreed to project modifications and conditions, it would allow the project to be approvable. That's what we're dealing with tonight. The staff recommendation is a concurrence with condition. There's also a conditional concurrence. Sorry, it's federal language that makes me chuckle sometimes, because conditional concurrence means that the state is putting conditions on a project that the developer does not agree to. And those conditions, in the state's opinion, would satisfy the need for that review to have that project be consistent with the state's enforceable policies. However, if BOEM or the developer disagree with those state conditions, the conditional concurrence is treated as an objection and is therefore automatically appealed to the Secretary of Commerce. We are not doing that. And lastly, the state can issue an objection. And we can object if, based on sufficient information to review a consistency certification, the state finds the project will be inconsistent with specific enforceable policy, or the developer has failed to supply the required information necessary to determine consistency. That objection could also trigger an appeal process. And then lastly, Act 15 CFR 930.78B, if a state fails to issue a consistency decision by the end of the consistency review period, which for us is the end of this month, the 29th, a concurrence shall be conclusively presumed and no mutually agreed to conditions will be applicable to the project. CRMC's Federal Consistency Review Authority for SouthCoast is specifically under 15 CFR 930 subpart D, consistency for activities requiring a federal license or permit, and subpart E, consistency for OCS, explorations, development, and production activities. As I mentioned, CRMC's automatic review exists because the export cable corridor is located with Rhode Island's two GLDs, the 2011 and 2018 GLDs. We are not here to review the actual wind farm. That is outside of our GLD. We are only here to look at the impacts of the export cable as it makes its way out of the lease area, which is out of our review area, and through the two GLDs. So, to finish our review process, the staff recommendation that you all have in your packet, we are here to discuss that tonight at the meeting and get a decision from the council on whether or not council agrees that staff recommendation. And once that decision is made, staff will issue a letter to BOEM on or before December 29th, based on the decision tonight, that if we do not meet that December 29th deadline, the project is resumed concurrent with our policies and all the conditions will be wiped off. So we'd like to get all that done, obviously, before the 29th of this month. Under the project description, the proponent SouthCoast Wind are here to develop the SouthCoast Wind Farm, which for, again, our consistency review is limited to the Brayton Point export cable corridor in federal waters only, and not the turbine locations themselves. The export cable corridor crosses through both GLDs, the 2011 and 2018. It will consist of up to 6 cables wrapped in 2 cable bundles. Each bundle will have 2 high voltage direct current cables and 1 communication cable. The export cable corridor is surveyed to be up to 2,300 feet wide, and cables will be installed in an approximately 19.7 foot wide construction corridor at 328 feet of length. The cables will span 27 miles and 22.7 miles through the 2 GLDs respectively, for a total of 49.7 miles. There's a 4-year phased export cable installation period, the purpose of which is to provide the developer with flexibility by a broad project development envelope, so that as the project progresses, the project can adapt to changes in technology and evolve. Within Those 4 years, however, each cable installation will take approximately 178 days to complete. And I'm sure the developer can go into a little more detail on that. The export cable corridor is dominated by sandy sediments conducive to cable burial, but the project does cross areas of boulder fields and complex bottom habitat. And as you can see in the 5 conditions that staff is recommending that have been worked out with the developer, we've addressed how those boulder field impacts and complex bottom habitat impacts will be managed and mitigated. So we have a concurrence with conditions. The federal consistency review requires the staff to determine whether a project's consistency certification adequately demonstrates whether a proposed project would be consistent with Rhode Island's enforceable policies. Initially, almost 2 years ago, staff determined that the developer's consistency certification did not adequately demonstrate consistency. Therefore, over these past 18+ months, we worked with the developer to refine the project and mutually agree to the 5 conditions contained in the staff report recommendations, which you can see on pages 8 and 9. For further clarification, project refinements, modifications, and mitigation may include micrositing of the cables, will include micrositing of the cables to avoid certain habitats and bottom conditions, agreeing to reporting requirements in the conditions previously mentioned, and minimize the use of a boulder plow where possible. And additionally, CRMC and developer are in the early stages of agreeing to a memorandum of understanding to ultimately facilitate a survey of fishing activity along the export cable corridor. We're still working with the developer. They're committed to doing that with us. That is not part of this, but it's something that will be further added to the project that CRMC can use to help further mitigate these impacts. So in conclusion, staff has determined that based on the mutually agreed upon conditions and other mitigation efforts that will be employed by the developer and required by BOEM, the proposed SouthCoast Offshore Wind Renewable Energy Project can be deemed to comply with the enforceable policies of the Rhode Island Coastal Energy Code. Staff recommends the council issue a concurrence with conditions in this matter for 15 CFR 930.4 and 930.7. Happy to answer any questions you all may have.
I think you indicated that they were mutually agreed upon. I just want to make sure I understood that the applicant agrees with the conditions and so forth. They were part of the discussion.
Yes, Mr. Chair, the answer to your question is yes, they have, and they can go into a little more detail to answer that question when they are in front of you. But staff and the developer met weekly during the business hours for much of this 18-month period, especially the last several, like 6 months or so. We also met every Thursday night at 5:30 with the developer and the general public. We invited all the FAB members, even though they had resigned. We invited them individually. We invited other members of those similar stakeholder communities. We met very regularly. And in addition to those set meetings, we also picked up the phone daily, Kyle, and talked to their staff on various issues, these being subjects.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Willis? Ms. Hall?
Can you go back in and just provide a little bit more information on this memorandum of understanding regarding the fishery survey? What is the purpose of that?
So one of the things we're trying to get a handle on, with not just this developer, but all, is what type of fishing actually occurs out there. We have no data on a lot of the commercial fishing activities, but what we don't necessarily have good data on is the recreation. So we're looking at ways to find more data, empirical, as best we can, that could help us inform what goes on in the offshore environment for future activities, as well as in this general area too. So it's part of a more holistic approach to looking at offshore waters and trying to get a handle of what fishing activities.
So what is the MOU do?
Well, it's basically, we haven't worked out the logistics yet, but we have an understanding with the developer that we will come up with a way to conduct these surveys or studies to get this type of information.
So the MOU binds the agency to do these studies?
No, the developer.
And so is that towards any of our enforceable policies relative to, for example, net benefit or loss or overall net loss of the fishery?
For future projects, it could help inform how we look at activity impacts relative to our enforcement policies.
But the surveys that you want conducted in no way impact the ability of the agency to make that assessment for this particular
Correct.
project. So the MOU would bind this applicant to do a study that doesn't relate to this application.
But it will help with the overall data, the lack of data that exists for fishing in the offshore environment,
So in the offshore environment, not relative to the cable.
along the cable corridor.
Let the record reflect Ms. Brown says. Join this. Any other questions of Mr. Willis at this time? Seeing none, we'll turn over to the applicant to figure that identify yourself and.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the council, as well as CRMC staff. For the record, my name is Christian Pepizzo. I'm the Environmental and Energy Chair at Partridge Stone Home in Providence. Prior to that, for Mr. Russolino and Mr. Flynn, who have not presented to before, I served as the lead environmental enforcement attorney for the state under the Attorney General's office for 10 years, where I served as outside counsel for CRMC, worked with Mr. Willis, and CRMC enforcement, many of the staff here tonight, as well as Mr. Gagnon and DEN. But tonight, I'm here before you on behalf of SouthCoast Wind for federal consistency review. And what I want to do is I want to thank Mr. Willis for his leadership, as well as the staff for their guidance and cooperation over those 18 months that Mr. Willis just referred to. This is the sixth project that this council staff has worked on, and that many of these members have heard testimony. And I went back and looked at the ones you most recently reviewed and heard, and that was over 24 hours of testimony that some of you council members, excluding Vineyard Wind, that you've heard. So you're well versed in your obligations under federal consistency. So for tonight, we have several presenters who are up here at the table that will be presenting on 1, 2, 3, 4 areas. We'll do project introduction overview. That will be with Jennifer Flood, who's senior permitting. Jen, if you want to raise your hand, as well as with Kyle Cassidy, Marine Science Permitting Manager. Kyle. We'll next turn it over to Amy Thurlow, who's the export cable lead, and she'll talk up to the council and staff about cables and installation methods. We'll next go back to Kyle for the monitoring plans, and then we'll turn it over to Sam Ashe, our fisheries manager, to talk to you about the fisheries. We also have other members of the SouthCoast Wind team in the room to answer any questions that the council may have as it relates to this application, which, as Mr. Willis said, will focus on 50 miles of export cable corridor in the GLDs. So with that, I will ask Mr. Longo to swear in the witnesses.
Everyone who's going to testify on behalf of Bush, SWF. That's SouthCoast Wind. Raise your right hand. You swear or affirm the testimony you give tonight, you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If you each state your name for the members.
Kyle Cassidy.
Jennifer Flood. Amy Thurlow.
Sam Ashe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Longo. And just for the record, I will introduce Ms. Flood, Mr. Ashe's, Ms. Thurlow, and Mr. Cassidy's CVs, just so you have them for the record, if I may approach Mr. Chairman. Thank you. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Flood. You can introduce yourself and just give the council a little bit of information about your background and role with SouthCoast Wind.
Sure, thank you, Christian. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Flood, and I'm the permitting director with SouthCoast Wind Energy. I've been on the team specifically working on the development and the permitting of the project for the last 4 years. And before that, I was doing permitting for offshore wind in the consulting side of the industry. I really appreciate that we're all here tonight, especially given the traffic conditions, and that we have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about ourselves and our project. And I would echo what Kristen said. We appreciate the leadership from CRMC and the CRMC staff in particular. working closely over the last 18 months that led to this meeting tonight and to a very comprehensive staff report. So I'm going to start and just introduce the project. SouthCoast Wind is a 50-50 joint venture between Shell New Energies and Ocean Winds. Our parent companies bring strong expertise and experience in large-scale energy projects, as well as specifically offshore wind projects. They both have projects that have reached the construction and operations phase abroad in Europe and the UK. And they have separate projects that are also in the development phase here in the US. SouthCoast Wind has roughly 75 full-time employees that are currently dedicated to the development phase of this project. So we on the SouthCoast Wind team are very passionate about this project's ability to contribute to the fight against climate change, and specifically to the net zero emissions in the region of New England and Rhode Island. We will be one of the largest contributors towards the New England net zero emissions goals. And we have estimated that the project will eliminate roughly 4 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. We also are very excited about the project's opportunity to contribute roughly 8% to the current administration's goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind. So in addition to the clean energy goals and contributions of the project, we also think that our project will bring many benefits to the region, including to Rhode Island. We are working very closely with supply chain opportunities and have estimated that the development, construction, operations, and decommissioning phases of the project will generate thousands of new jobs. We work closely with a number of local Rhode Island affiliations, including the ones shown on the screen. Most recently, we've been working closely with Supply RI, which is out of Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, on identifying some local initiatives, both for education and supply chain opportunities. And we're excited to advance opportunities with the local blue economy. And we're also excited for later this month, we will be announcing roughly $500,000 in grants to be awarded to Rhode Island and Massachusetts nonprofits. So this slide shows an overview of the entire SouthCoast Wind project, and what is on this map represents the project that appears in our federal permits, including our construction and operations plan that's currently with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This slide shows our full lease area, which is the OCSA 0521 lease area, which we acquired in 2018 from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management auction. And that lease area is just over 127,000 acres in size. We have agreed to the 1-by-1 nautical mile grid layout for our turbines. And with that, we will have up to 149 positions to be occupied by a wind turbine generator or an offshore substation platform. With those 149 positions, we estimate that we can generate roughly 2,400 megawatts of clean energy to be supplied to the New England grid. The lease area is just under 60 miles south of the Rhode Island coast. And we do include in our federal permits 2 export cable corridors, or ECCs, that will connect to shore. One is the Falmouth Cable Corridor that makes landfall on Cape Cod. And the other, which we'll talk about tonight, is the Brayton Point Export Cable Corridor. And that is the one that travels through the Rhode Island geographic location descriptions, Rhode Island state waters, and ultimately makes landfall at Brayton Point in Somerset, Massachusetts. The Brayton Point ECC is our preferred export cable corridor for both of our projects that will be developed in the lease area. And that's why we're really focusing the conversation there tonight. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Kyle, who will really focus on the portion of the Brayton Point cable corridor within the GLDs.
Thanks, Jen. So just mirroring along what Director Willis said, the review for our SouthCoast Wind project tonight is focused on the cable route, which I circled here. And it's the 50 miles of export cable corridor cable installation that happens within the 2011 and 2018 Rhode Island GLDs. And I understand, differing from some different projects, it is just the cable route that we are focusing on. And I know that there are some confusion about the state waters portion of it, which I'll just assure everyone will handle that with a separate category B ascent process, hopefully happening later in 2024 with all of you folks. We'll revisit a lot of these same issues, but with the state perspective, we really spread out this. Just to give an overview of the project that you're reviewing, this is the indicative project schedule, and it's a very conservative project schedule that we have in our latest version of the COP. This here brings you from the onshore scope all the way down through the offshore wind turbine generator commissioning. And as Director Willis said, and you know, I think he did a great job of advocating this point to you all. The total installation of the export cable corridor is roughly a 4-year period that is in the reports. However, the items that we're reviewing here today are a 178-day period for project 1 and another 178-day period for project 2. And in that 178-day period, all of the activities that my colleague Amy will talk about occur for the export cable corridor installation occur within that window. Next, we're going to talk about the cables installation process. Amy's going to talk to you about some of the technical aspects of cable installation, but first I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've already done to date for this project, which includes our benthic habitat mapping studies and our cable routing surveys. So the benthic habitat mapping study uses a wide range of data to characterize the benthic habitat in the seafloor. That data, along with other information from geotechnical and geophysical data, gets input into our cable routing study. This cable routing study then allows us to have a really well-defined and well-surveyed area that allows us to avoid really complex habitats in those glacial moraine areas, otherwise known to you all as micrositing or micro-routing. We also have an additional analysis plan, late 24, early 2025, where we're going to in more further detail analyze all of the data that we've collected to help gather greater detail on boulder density and size, and also work to help find an area where we could aggregate our boulder relocations to help minimize our impact on the commercial fishery industry to reduce hangs. My colleague Sam, will talk about the fisheries, will also hit on that point. And we'll also note that we had Dr. Brian Oakley and Dr. John King do an independent review of all of these data, and they had consistent results confirming that we can most certainly avoid any complex habitats based on their review. And with that, I will now hand it over to Amy.
Thank you, Kyle. So the export cable is approximately 100 miles long in totality from the lease to the onshore location. The section that we're talking about here is approximately 50 miles in length to go through the GLDs. The cable will be buried. Our target burial depth is approximately 6 feet, and that will depend on sediment types and what we're going through, and areas that we're going through, but 6 feet is our target depth for burial. This is an HVDC cable, and so we'll have 2 cables, and we'll bundle those cables and we'll have fiber optics cable with that. So that diameter for that bundle is 13 inches. And so we'll have 2 bundles, one for project 1 and one for project 2. Project 1 will be the first one that we'll be doing the installation on. Project 2 would be later on at a further date. And this just gives you an example of what a standard cable laying vessel looks like. You can see the carousel that carries the cable in it. There's the cables will be bundled on the vessel and then installed from there. So this is some examples of some standard equipment that we would use during the installation process. We'll use a graphical plow, which will allow us to remove marine debris from the seafloor ahead of us going in to install our cable. We'll also use an orange peel grabber, which will allow us to pick up individual boulders if needed. Worst case, there's also, we show an example of a boulder clearing plow, but we're trying to avoid using that as much as possible. For trenching, this is an example of a trenching ROV, which will allow fluidization, jetting or cutting of the seabed as we're doing our installation. So, the timeline of events, the overall schedule that you see within the COP shows a 4-year schedule, and that's for the entire export cable process. So we're looking at from starting engineering, to manufacturing, to loading out, to transport, from installation activities to commissioning and power going through. So that's a long process within that. What we're looking at for the GLD, it's 178 days. Within that 178 days, we have a lot of different steps and activities we do within that, but they're not consecutive days. So we'll start that process with a relay survey. So we've already done surveys in the past. It's helped guide our engineering design. We'll do a survey before construction occurs to verify seabed conditions at that time. Following that, we'll do a relay grapple run that is meant to remove any of the marine debris that's in the area. It'll take 3 runs. 1 run will go along the center line, and then we'll do runs on each wing of that to get that corridor to make sure we're clear. Following that, if there are boulders that we've identified that need to be relocated, we'll take that time to do the boulder relocation. Ideally, we'd like to be able to relocate the boulders short distance away, 10 to 20 meters away from where we first picked the boulder from. But we will be working very closely with the agencies and fisheries on what's the best methodology, what's the best course of action for us for the boulder relocation. But we do take that very, very seriously. We do understand that for fisheries, these boulders are they're a habitat, but they're also a risk for hang-ups on their fishing gear. Following that, we do have some cable crossings or pipeline crossings along the corridor. We need to protect those assets and ours, and so we will pre-lay mattresses down over those areas we'll be doing our crossings at, and then we'll start our cable lay. So we're going to be starting cable lay from the near shore going towards the offshore environment. And so we will lay the cable. We'll have guard vessels around us at that time as we're doing lay to help communicate with locals that we are in the area. We do have here, we are operating there just to help minimize the impacts that we could have on locals around. And then post that, we'll do cable burial. And so with that, that's where we use the jetting sled that will, the submit types that we have are fine sands and finer. And so jetting sled should be able to bury our cable to our target depth at that first time. Post that, then we'll do our remedial burial that we need to do. So if we're not able to achieve our burial depth, we will actually attempt to do a second round with the sled and trying to catch it a second time. We will not go back a 3rd or 4th time just because at that point we may end up burying our sled instead of the cable. Not what we want. If the second pass for burial does not work, then at that point we'll look at alternate methods, and that's where we'll lay mattresses if we're not able to achieve our burial depth. And then in any area where we did a crossing, we will also put concrete mattresses over our cable to them to check our cable from that. And then after that, we'll do our post-lay survey. And so that gives us our as-built survey with the map. And I guess I'm done. There you go. So some of our seabed prep, one of the first items that we really want to focus on in 24 is to be able to do a boulder study. We've gathered quite a bit of data over the last several years, especially in 2023. We have enough data that we were commissioning a boulder study. And with that, we would like to use that information to further microsite the cable to avoid, some of these boulder fields or some of the boulders. In addition, if we find areas that we are not able to microsite, that we do need to do a relocation, identify what those boulders are, have the X, Y, and Z there, and then identify good locations where we can move them to. I'm in agreement about that, so we can communicate ahead of time versus communicating afterwards from that. And so, and then in addition, the pre-lay grapple run, which will remove the seabed debris, and then we'll do a pre-lay survey, and this is an example of the survey equipment that will be used during the pre-lay survey, but then also post-lay survey. So as we're trenching, we're actually surveying at the same time as trenching. because we're looking for where the cable is, ensure that's where we wanted it to be, and also that it's achieving its value within that. And so we'll use the standard bottom imager for that standard imaging. And we will be working in close coordination with different agencies and with the fisheries through this process and being able to communicate throughout this entire process. And recently, actually, the state of Massachusetts has given guidance on border relocation, seabed preparations, and we are taking that guidance into consideration in our forward plans. So our corridor width is 1,600 to 2,300 feet wide. We did a wide corridor because we wanted the ability to have some maneuverability. And when we first started gathering this data, you have oh, this is where I want to go. And then as you gather data, you can fine tune down, but you always want to have that ability that we can maneuver ourselves. And so that's where our future studies, we're able to microsite things. We're able to know where everything is on the seabed. We go for a wide corridor. We do have 2 cable bundles. Project 1 will be the first one that we'll be installing in 28. The second, project 2, that installation will not happen until 2030-ish. Those 2 bundles will be about 320 feet apart, space apart for that. And that depends on site conditions. Also, there's some flexibility and some final design we have to do with that. That's approximately what we're looking at for the spacing on that. And then for cable protection, this is a great example of what a concrete mattress looks like. So concrete mattress is what we are intending on using for any of our crossings, but also if we do not achieve our burial depth, the concrete mattresses, they have rounded edges, they're flexible. They also are, I don't want to say trawl resistant, but because of the rounded edges, they don't snag. And so for fisheries and trawling, they go over it and we don't have to worry about doing damage to equipment. And they're also just friendly to the environment. They're very low profile. They will conform to the environment that they're laid in. Sediment tends to kind of infill in it because you have all these nice little crevices in there, and a lot of habitats like to form within these concrete mattresses, and so it's quite beneficial to the natural environment. Other things that we can do for cable protection would be rock bags or putting down half shells. And so it kind of depends on the area, but our preference is really to be able to do concrete mattresses. And I think that's all for cables.
So next I'm going to talk about the benthic monitoring that we have planned so far. With the benthic monitoring that's going to occur within the Rhode Island GLD along the export cable corridor, we've developed this in conjunction with Inspire Environmental, who I'm sure you're very familiar with at this point. And the idea is that we're going to look at what the physical disturbances are to the environment around the cable installation. And the approach we're using is it's an optical camera-based survey. It's called SPY-PV, sediment profile imaging in plain view. It takes a downward image of the seafloor, and then it takes a cross section to look at the first top layer of the benthic environment. And this is designed as a stratified random survey. So our strata for this were selected based on the different habitat types we identified within the GLD area. And there are 3 main ones. There's the complex habitat, which you can kind of see in the brown box to the left. There's a sand habitat, which is the yellow box, and then the gray box is more of a coarse sediment, a mixed sediment type. Within each of those habitat types, we'll randomly select stations. We do them in triplicate, so there are three replicates on each side of the cable, so we have 6 samples total at each of these locations. And they're a gradiated design, so it's designed to take a look at the impact right at this point of installation of where the cable is laid, and then at varying distances outside of it to see what the degree of the impact away from the center line of the cable is. This is also designed as a before and after study. So what we do is we'll go in at before a seabed preparation activity occurs, and we'll do a survey. Then we'll go back out within the first year after cable installation is what's occurred. Generally in the late fall, early fall or late summer. That's when you have the most benthic diversity and the habitats that's most rich. And then we'll come back 3 years later to characterize the environment again using the same methodology. And the idea is this is we'll see, and we'll be able to gauge the degree of physical disturbance that still exists, or we'll also be able to determine if the habitat has returns to native conditions or if it shows actually increase in biodiversity. And with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Sam Ashley. We're going to talk about our fisheries program.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kyle, and good evening, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's nice to have the opportunity to speak with you all. My name is Sam Ashley. I'm the fisheries manager for SouthCoast Wind. I've been with SouthCoast since June of this year. Prior to that, I worked as a staff member for the New England Fisheries Management Council. And prior to that, I was a student in marine science at the School for Marine Science and Technology at UMass Dartmouth. So in all of my roles, I've been able to have the good fortune of work closely with fishermen. Happy to be able to do that in my current role. There's a considerable amount of overlap between commercial and recreational fishing and the entirety of the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and lease area. Our project's no exception to that, nor is the area of review for this process, which is within the Rhode Island GLDs. So I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the measures that we're developing and plans that we're putting in place to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to fishermen, especially those from Rhode Island. So some of the first step really is getting a full understanding of the marine species that are targeted by fishermen out of Rhode Island that exist within our project area. Understand a baseline before construction, and then follow that through during construction and into operations to get a fuller understanding of the impact of our project development and operations on those resources. So we're working closely with partners based in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts to get an assessment of through our fisheries monitoring plan, one that's focused on inshore waters of Rhode Island, the other that's focused within the lease area. These are looking at commercially and recreationally viable species that exist throughout the project area, including within the overlapping area of the 50 miles of the GLD. So while these fishery monitoring plans are really taking place outside of the area of this review, the fish don't necessarily observe those boundaries. They move throughout. The fish that are observed and the invertebrates that are observed in both FMP areas exist within the GLDs. So we're using that as a proxy moving forward. So a big part of my role is engagement with the fishing community. This comes in several forms. I'm actively communicating with fishermen that are either operating within our project area, whether that's during ongoing survey campaigns, which has really been the case up to this point since construction hasn't commenced yet. Once we do get to that stage, I'll be actively communicating with fishermen to hopefully avoid any negative impacts that they might suffer had that communication not occurred. We're also communicating with fishermen generally through the use of our fisheries representatives. We have 3 of them. We have one that's based in Rhode Island, somebody that you're all familiar with. It's the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island, led by Fred Matera. We're lucky to have Fred to work with us in sort of a two-way form of communication with fishermen in Rhode Island. He's telling us the issues that are important to Rhode Island fishermen. We're able to account for that within our permitting and project development process. So we're lucky to be able to have that relationship to rely on. There's a lot of other things that we're doing that are outlined within the staff report. So I'm not going to get into every single one of them. A lot of them are probably repetitive from projects that you've heard in the past. We are happy to be working with fishermen for those that are interested in being involved and taking advantage of the opportunities where scout work is a big part of our project need. We're sending vessels out prior to any on-water activities, including within the GLD area, to identify fixed fishing gear or other fishing operations that will hopefully allow for me to communicate to those fishermen to make sure that when we do get out on the water, we're not causing negative impacts or financial impacts to lost gear and things like that. We also have fishery onboard representatives on many of our surveys to date. I think we'll plan to have that within our plan moving forward. Basically, these are fishermen who are former fishermen with experience who are able to communicate to other fishermen on the water to speak in similar language so that we can all understand what's going on and so that we can best do our job and allow them to do their job at the same time without creating any negative impacts. We also have within our permitting made very clear commitments to clear communication when it comes to local notices to mariners. So anytime we're doing any form of on-water activity, whether it's survey work or it's sediment sampling, or eventually when we get to the construction period, construction and cable installation. We will be communicating to local fishermen. We've already had the good fortune to work with our colleagues at RIDEM to have a more targeted outreach effort for a recent sediment survey sampling program that occurred, where we were able to identify fishermen that were more likely to be impacted by the sediments sampling efforts and get the notice out to them so that they knew what was going on. So this slide, there's no pictures, there's a lot of bullets. This is a lot of stuff that's summarized quite well in detail in the staff report. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but the one that I did want to lean on has already been mentioned by both Kyle and Amy. It's one that's really important to us, and that's on the Cape, especially within the Rhode Island GLD area where we have our 50-mile stretch of cable, and that's related to boulder relocation. This is a paramount issue in my eyes and in the eyes of our team. We recognize that the fishermen that operate out of Rhode Island and Massachusetts and other adjacent states know the area that they fish incredibly well. They are able to dial in the way that they fish to a matter of feet or yards to what are known hangs. The way that we're going to be successful is by making sure that we're not creating any hazards in the water, additional hangs that our fishermen are either unaware of or have not been informed of if they do occur. So we're doing our best to avoid any situation like that by integrating input from fishermen early on into our boulder relocation program. That'll come a little bit farther down the line once we've identified a cable installation contractor. But that is one of the conditions and commitments that you'll see within the staff report. So we're pleased to be able to do that. And then I'll also point to the gear loss program. This is another really important one. Fortunately, we have not had to issue, I think we've issued a total of 2 gear loss claims, which I think is a good testimony to our proactive engagement and communication with fishermen during our survey campaigns that have occurred over the past couple of years. But just to say that program's in place, it will continue to be in place through construction. So I'll leave the rest to your close reading in the staff report when we get there. So this is all to say we are doing a lot to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to fishermen. But it's also, we recognize that there will be a financial impact to the way that fishermen operate as a result of the development and operation of our project as a whole. Within the area of this review, which is the overlapping cable with the Rhode Island GLDs, we're really talking about the impacts to fishermen's bottom lines as a result of cable installation. So as a way to assess the impacts, economic impacts to those fishermen, we have been working with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to conduct a fisheries exposure analysis. You're all familiar with WHOI. You're certainly familiar with the exposure analysis, which I think you've probably reviewed at least a handful of times before us. So we're taking the same approach. We're using the same data inputs, just updated for more recent data. And again, we're focusing on the area of review for this process, which is really the GLDs, and it excludes the mid-lease area. Kyle already noted this, but this is not the last time we'll be talking about fisheries compensation. That will also be handled through the Category B ascent process, which will really be focused on state waters. So for today, and for the purpose of this review, we're really focused on the area of overlap with the mid-GLDs. So, as I said, and as you're all aware, WHOI's conducted several of these analyses. We're using the same methods. It's generally the same data. It's formatted in the same way. So I'm not going to go through every detail, but from sort of a boiled down perspective, this analysis takes existing data within federal waters that's provided to us by National Marine Fisheries Service. It's based on vessel trip reports and dealer reports. What we did is we took a look at the area of overlap of our export cable corridor within the GLDs that is likely to be impacted by cable installation. And from that, we're able to assess an annual average value associated with commercial and for hire charter fishing within that area, and then adjust those data to account for species that are typically underreported in that data, as well as multipliers that account for upstream and downstream indirect and induced effects as a result of the economic impact. So once that's all said and done, There's a series of assumptions that are applied to the annual value, which basically look at the impact not only to the ability of fishermen to operate normally within the area, but also the potential impacts to shellfish and fish species that exist. And then from that, we're able to assess the total economic impact for commercial and for hire charter fishermen. So that number for our project through the HUI analysis is estimated to be $234,000. Now, this number is considerably lower than that of other projects that you've reviewed in the past. And that's really a function of the jurisdiction of this review as it relates to our project versus the projects that have preceded us through this process. So our area, as it's been said several times, excludes the lease area, right? That's where the majority of fishing occurs across the entirety of the Mass and Rhode Island wind lease area, and our project area is no exception. It's also the figure on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a little busy, and I recognize from this angle, it's tough to make out exactly what's going on here. So I'll just try and describe it very briefly. This is there's 4 panes on this chart. They all show recent fishing effort heat maps. So blue represents lower fishing, red represents the most fishing, and if there's no area that's lit up with any of those colors, that means there's no fishing, or at least not estimated within the data we're using. Within that, you can see the boundaries for the GLD areas, as well as the cable route that we're focusing on here, that 50-mile stretch. Just as a result of the siting of this project, there's some natural separation between the fishing that does occur within the GLDs and the actual area that our project will be running through. So that's just a little bit more context for why that number, I suppose, is lower than those that you've seen in the past. And to keep in mind that this is not the last time that we'll be talking about fisheries. We'll go to the next slide, please. So when it comes down to it, we have provided an outline within the staff recommendation in the term sheets for a compensatory mitigation fund for commercial, for hire, and recreational fishermen. That totals $280,000. Of that, the vast majority at $250,000 is intended for to be allocated to commercial and for hire fishermen who are directly impacted by the project. These would be paid out through direct claims through the Rhode Island Future Fishermen's Viability Trust, which is a trust that was set up by developers that have gone through this process before us following that precedent. $30,000 of that package is aimed at general support. This is more of an indirect community-based fund where the funds aren't going to any one individual, but rather they're there for supporting the community as a whole. This could take a lot of different forms. Some of them are described on the screen: training programs, fisheries and marine science research, navigational safety or equipment upgrades. And this is also, I think there's a question related to the survey that could be focused on how to improve our understanding of the true impact of the development and operation of offshore wind to recreational fishermen. We see this as the avenue to support that through our funding. So that's all I had for fisheries. And I believe that concludes the presentation of the whole.
With that, we'll just thank everyone for listening, and this time hand it out and back over for Director Willis.
Any questions?
Question remote, one of the maps in your presentation is figure 3, not one that you showed on the screen. It's the areas of concern, the areas to avoid. In our packet, it's page 63. You have that? 64, and that's in, you know, packet. Your figure 3.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So as I'm looking at that, it appears that part of your line sort of skirts along the edge of an area to avoid, as opposed to just going a little bit further west and avoiding it completely. And then as you get further north, it looks like there's an area that you also traverse But it also looks like there would be a narrow area that would seem to be less of it. I'm just curious as to why the line in the first case doesn't avoid that sort of long area completely. In the second, case, why not go to a narrower stroke? That is my question, Chris.
So this, we went through multiple iterations of routing for the export cable.
Mhm.
And each of those iterations, there was improvement, but, so this is based on what that green is the corridor. So that will be that total width of the 2,600 feet. So it shows you that whole corridor. So within that corridor, we survey data and we're able to get more detailed information for that. So what you're seeing is very much a zoomed out look. And so we've got further data within these areas. And so we have routed through those areas. Part of that had to do with some other constraints on either side of like that one area where we're kind of skirting just on the outside of it. We had some constraints that were pushing us to stick to that very edge of it. And also keep in mind when we were doing the very initial route, this is what our route is. A lot of times regional data sets can I don't think flexibility is the right word. There's not enough known to say, well, maybe we actually could go through that area, and further data would give us that information to be able to say, yes, we could go through that area. So these areas were looked at from Oakley and King, and they had also given us a thumbs up that we were selecting the best route for these areas.
They're saying that the best route is to go through an area of concern and an area to avoid, as opposed to not going through an area of concern and an area to avoid. It seemed to me to be the opposite. See, it would seem that you'd want to avoid.
So we've avoided, right, so, but this is the whole entire corridor that's going through this area. And so when you go in, zoomed in deeper with the data that we were able to gather within those areas, we were able to avoid the habitats to go through. And so there's the
Okay. I'm not sure if I really quite understand your response, but just another question about the equipment. Is it remotely how is it done remotely, or are there people actually on the seafloor moving those files? Or
so the equipment is next to the cable laying vessel or to any of the other vessels, and so it's tethered to the vessel and operated from the vessel.
okay. So there's no one down.
No, we will,
It's just curious.
yeah, diver operation is quite dangerous, and we would like to stay away from diver operations.
One other question about the fifth condition about the fisheries research and monitoring plan. That part of the conditions that have been developed by the staff. Who monitors the monitoring plan?
Who monitors the monitoring plan? So
You'll develop a monitoring plan. Who monitors you?
So we are conducting our monitoring plans in collaboration with Inspire Environmental and the School of Marine Science and Technology. So we were involved in the development of those to ensure that the plans meet the requirements that are laid out for us by BOEM, as well as the state water requirements, but the actual field work, data collection, data warehousing, and summarizing and reporting lies with the research institutions that are conducting those fishery monitoring plans. So we don't necessarily have a role. I mean, we're Kyle and I are technical marine scientists, but we're not the ones that are directing the on-water research or writing the reports. We're really reviewing them on the back end, ensuring that they line up with the requirements that we put in place for the actual monitoring plans, but. And then those, of course, would be reviewed by Dawn as well.
We've also agreed to share the annual reports with CRMC. As soon as survey activity starts, very applicable and relevant to and tree monitoring survey. We've agreed to share those reports with you.
Mr. Flynn, to answer your question, Paul is the overseer for these reports that we piggybacked. And the developer has agreed to share that data through those BOEM required and BOEM overseen studies. We'll get those results as well.
Oh,
I just have a couple of quick questions regarding fisheries and working with fisheries. When you said several times, and it's in the material, you're working closely with fisheries and agencies, and you talked about some of your collaboration with Commercial Fisheries of Rhode Island and some other organizations, but with respect to secondary protection and boulder relocation and notices to council as to the location of those relocated boulders and the location of those mattresses and secondary protection, how does the fishing community, and when you say working closely with them, how do they know where things end up? I guess exactly. You talked about hangs, you talked about hazards, you talked about gear loss. What is the mechanism by which the fishers actually know where those changes have been made?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'll say is that we are looking forward to integrating the input from commercial fishermen into our boulder relocation plan, because that, for one, will give folks an idea of, or that will give us a better idea too of where the preferred areas are, where if we need to pick a big old boulder up and move it somewhere, what's the best way to do that so that you can continue fishing in the way that you were within that area. So we're going to take that input. We're going to figure out what the limitations are from the perspective of our cable installation contractor when they're identified. And we're going to figure out in the end, anytime we move a boulder or anytime we lay secondary protection, we're going to be taking the precise coordinates of those areas. We're going to communicate those directly to the CRMC, other partners, but also a lot of this, I believe, is going to be updated through charts that are used on AIS. This will come together more as we get closer to construction and where we're actually moving boulders if we actually need to. But what some of the other developers are doing, for example, is providing fishermen with uploads through USB sticks that basically updates their charts to reflect the additional boulder that's been moved or the secondary protection that's been laid.
So you do have plans to include it in AIS and to provide that kind of technical?
We will have those, we will have those plans. We're not at a stage yet to do that right now because we haven't fully developed the boulder relocation plan, but that's a step.
Yeah, understood, but I didn't know if there was a commitment to that. I didn't see it in the material.
I don't think that we talked about that specifically. I'm not sure that that's called out in the condition, but.
No, it's not in the condition
okay.
that we have,
Okay.
but I was just wondering if that's a commitment that you have made.
Yep.
And then it's not kind of a combination of two questions. My last question is regarding your compensation and the existing data. And I'm curious, like, is there a way where, and this is solely up to the developer in terms of what data they use, but is there conversation, since you're working so closely with the commercial fisheries in Rhode Island, is there conversation about the relative usefulness of fishing trip reports versus vessel monitoring systems that actually create a map of where the gear is deployed as opposed to the reporting? I mean, I think the trip reports have a serious lack of the kind of detailed information that fishers might find more useful. So are you in conversations with them to rethink that baseline data and maybe rethink how, I mean, I think it's really integral to a lot of what your operations are and your commitment to fisheries.
think it's an excellent point, and I think the point that you make isn't just relevant for our project or the purpose of this review. It's really across the board for fishery management, fish stock assessments, enforcement purposes. There are issues with data granularity when it comes to fishery dependent data, like what we're relying on for this analysis. The point about vessel monitoring systems. So yes, the most federally permitted fishing vessels are required to carry vessel monitoring systems. The rate at which they ping, which is the GPS tracker that's tracking where they are, varies by fishery. It depends on the requirements of where they're fishing. It gives you, I will say that VMS data does an excellent job of describing the total area in which the fishery is operating, but it does not do a very good job, from my experience, of attributing fishing effort to specific places, at least on the scale in which we're looking at through this analysis. So there have been efforts to tie together vessel trip reports, which are the more broad, lower resolution reports where you're basically saying I'm operating within a statistical reporting area or a general lat long that's associated with a trawl. But those are giving you the more specific data on here's how many pounds of fish I landed, here's the species, here's the value, and that can all be tied together. There is an effort, and there has been an effort for a long time at the Greater Atlantic Fisheries Office for NIMS up in Gloucester to tie together those two data sets. So you get what we saw before, which was like kind of a heat map, right? Where you see the resolution of where the fishery is operating and the intensity in which they're operating, and then tying that together with the economic values that are associated with the landings from the trip. So that actually is the data that was used in this analysis. Understanding that there's always limitations, and if you speak with an individual fisherman who operates within our area, the information they're going to give you is hands down the best that you can get, but it's unrealistic to do that across the board and not at a resolution where you could really rely on it, depend on it for an analysis like this.
But isn't the issue with vessel trip reports that you also can't rely on that all the time as well, because it's human dependent? You know, it's not a machine that's always on.
Sure.
It depends on the captain turning it on and off, you know, reporting the data, reporting the landing, reporting the trips. So I just wonder, like, across the board, how that would be more. I mean, I understand a one-on-one with someone who's actively doing it. Great, awesome data, but that's not the case with the entire fishery.
Right, but it actually, so it is, because the vessel trip reports are a condition of having.
Right, they have to do it, but it's not it's not always as accurate, right? As far as like where the gear is being deployed. It's accurate on landings, but not where. And I think that where seems to be a bigger issue with you guys.
Yes, but also that comes back to the exercise for the regional offices doing, where they tied together the VMS data set and the BTR data set to get their best guess at here's the actual fishing footprint for this fishery, and then here's the value that's assigned to it. So I understand your point, and on an individual basis, fisherman by fisherman, yes, you're right that the resolution of data that's submitted through a BTR is not really enough to assign that specific data point to within our project area or outside of our project area, or at the scale of the wind lease area. But tying together the fishery-wide VMS data and the fishery-wide BTR data gives you a best guess, which is really what we're working with here.
So are your numbers based on the VMS and the BTR combined? Is that the basis? Because I think you only said vessel trip reports.
Yeah, the numbers are coming from the vessel trip reports, but the spatial extent is associated to the VMS reports as well.
Thank you.
Further questions?
Somewhere in the staff, back and forth over the last couple of years, who were asked to do an analysis of routes that would avoid the Secana River completely, meaning little content or children. I did not see a response. I might have missed it as to why an alternative route could not have been.
We have done routing alternatives assessment, and we did look at 14 different routes to get to the grading point of interconnection. And those did include alternative routes both up on the west side and the east side of the Secana River, as well as going up the West Passage and East Passage, I believe. farther west. And there are a number of factors, both from land acquisition and timing for installation, traveling across certain areas that are affected by tourism or wildlife conservation areas that contributed to our findings that going up the Secundit River was the most efficient from a technical and cost perspective. We do have those reports that are public, and we can link you to those, the overall alternatives assessment, and that is also assessed by BOEM in the draft environmental impact statement as well.
Any questions?
No, if there's no other questions from the council or any questions from the staff, I just again want to thank the council for their time in their questions, in their review of the material. On behalf of SouthCoast Wind, we respectfully request that council approve the staff recommendation, as well as concur that the SouthCoast Wind project is consistent with CRMC's enforceable policies. The presenter will be available for questions as we move to the public comment section of the hearing. We'll still have other individuals here as well, so thank you very much.
Thank you. By show of hands, anyone else present this evening back with this? Two people. Two people. You can come back and don't come up one at a time.
We're getting too much feedback. Is that because we're getting feedback? Yeah.
You wishes to go first. Please come forward.
Hi, my name is Noelle English. Oh,
I need you last.
Or to the table. Thank you.
I need your name again.
hi, my name is Noelle English. I'm from
Spell your last name.
INGALLS.
Thank you.
I'm from Little Compton, Rhode Island, and I worked on the South Fork Wind project, and I was wondering, given what New York State was requiring in terms of water quality management and monitoring during operations inside state waters, what are the plans of the developer to monitor that? Additionally, given the trencher interface with subsea boulders, subsea fishing equipment, and issues with glacial till, I was wondering what the mitigation measures were proposed by the developer. That's all.
Let's see.
I can, Mr. Chair, if you'd like me to answer public comments, I can put some detail on that. I believe the comments are raised what state of New York did in state waters relative to what we would be doing here in Rhode Island state waters. We do not have an application in front of us for any part of this project in state waters. So I can't answer the question in terms of what water quality issues will, may, or can be done. That would have to be addressed when we actually get an application that's complete and ready to review.
Thanks. Well, please.
For the record, Elizabeth Quattrocki, QUATTROCKI, next, KNITH. Well, thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate it. I know that you guys have now seen a lot of these draft environmental impact statements. And
I wanted to comment on this one in particular because you might not have recognized some of the things that we're concerned about. So again, just like, am I talking loud enough?
Speak a little louder.
Yeah, again, like some of the other applications, this application lacks transparency that the ocean stamp actually requires. Again, this application does not release to the public the air emissions report. It doesn't release to the public the safety management system or the economic impacts on Rhode Island. So we think that given the fact that these companies are requesting quite a bit of subsidy tax break or tax subsidies to build them, that the public ought to have access to these reports. The other thing is navigation safety. So you talked about fishing. We all know that fishing is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. Well, if you approve this project, you will make that dangerous profession even more dangerous. Because we all know that turbines will disrupt the radar. The government document that discuss this issue states that the turbines will make SAR, so the search and operations, search and rescue operations more difficult. And this could result in, quote, otherwise avoidable loss of life due to maritime incidents. So this is a problem. We are actually going to make it more dangerous to be out there on the ocean for our fishermen. And the microsighting that we all have, think is necessary given the glacial moraine is going to make this worse. We talked about the tables tonight, and I want to bring up a few points about those tables. So they mentioned the jet clouds, but what you didn't hear about those jet clouds is that they will resuspend the toxins that have been settling in the seabed since the time of the Industrial Revolution. Rhode Island has been home to DuPont chemicals, to Phillips Petroleum, to all the jewelry companies, textile companies, and over the years, they have dumped all of those toxins into the seabed, into the bay, and now these are going to resuspend those toxins. SouthCoast Wind has not tested for all of those chemicals throughout the length of their cables. And in particular, they have not tested for the forever chemicals, the PFOAs, that our Attorney General and our President have decided is a priority. So Biden has decided that it is unacceptable to have any level of PFOAs in our drinking water. Our Attorney General, Peter Neronen, is bringing a suit against DuPont chemicals because they have contaminated our water. And we're allowing SouthCoast Wind to disrupt the seabed all the way up the Seconic River without ever having tested for PFOA. What they also didn't tell you in this particular presentation is that those jet clouds suck in water in order to spew it out again. And when they do that, they suck up everything else. So they suck up all of the fish larvae, all of the zooplankton, it's going to entrap billions of organisms. And in fact, SouthCoast itself said that it will actually kill 8.5 billion invertebrate zooplankton alone with their jet clouds. That's a lot. And in fact, what you also might not know is that just a 1% change in phytoplankton could produce more than the hundreds of millions of cubic tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that they're hoping to help with. The other thing that they didn't tell you about the seabed is that in their own DEIS, they say that it could take more than a decade to recover from. I'm going to go on, and it's not pretty. So the high voltage AC currents create heat. did they tell you that it's not just a little bit of heat, but 2 feet away from the cables will raise the temperature by 36 degrees Fahrenheit. In Florida, 2 degrees leached out 93% of the coral. 36 degrees, 2 feet away, is gonna do some damage, maybe a lot of damage. In addition, we've got the EMS. So the DC currents, the AC currents create the heat, the DC currents create the EMS. Well, there's been a new study out of Scotland that was published in the peer-reviewed journal of the Journal of Marine Science and Engineering that showed that lobster development is affected by the EMS. It causes birth defects. It causes birth defects that actually impact their survival. They predicted that EMS will have population level impacts on lobster. Population level impact is extinction. What about the substations? Did they mention that each substation is going to suck up 8 million gallons of water a day, of ocean water a day? If you think the jet plows are killing off microorganisms, zooplankton, fish larvae, think what 8 million gallons a day is going to do in one substation. They want 5 substations. Not only will it suck up the larva and all of the zooplankton, but it's also going to heat up the water, and they're going to discharge it out at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 million gallons a day times 5 substations times 90 degrees of heating, or heating up to 90 degrees. That is going to cause a lot of problems in our ecosystem. So beyond the substations and beyond the heating, they also will add chlorine to the water. So all of those 45 million gallons a day that are going to be going through the substation are going to be released with chlorine. Marine mammals. I have a particular interest in marine mammals, and I want you to know that SouthCoast Wind has more than 54% higher take requirements than all 4 of the other projects that you all have reviewed. So if you add up Revolution Wind, South Fork Wind, Sunrise Wind, and Vineyard Wind, South Coast Wind has 54% higher numbers of takes. They are asking for, and you all know what takes are, they're the permission to harm or harass marine mammals. They're asking for over 95,000 incidental takes, including 178 level A takes, which is permanent injury that can lead to death. So this project has a particularly high impact on our environment. But in the environmental impact statement, they say it will likely help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Likely. They have no data to support this. They have referenced not a single study, no empirical data to show that this is going to help reduce greenhouse gases. And that's because it most likely won't. There's a huge assumption there. And that is something that I, as a scientist, I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I'm a trained physician, and I'm on the faculty at Harvard. They have no data to support this. And that is disturbing, because we are all saying, okay, we need to do this because of climate change. But if it's not even going to help climate change, we should reevaluate what we're doing. And the foam itself, so the agency tasked with permitting these projects says in the Vineyard Wind DEIS, overall, it is anticipated that there will be no collective impact. That means all of the projects in our geographic area, no collective impact on global warming.
as a result of offshore wind projects, plural. And in the Revolution Wind PEIS, it says BOEM anticipates that the proposed action would have no measurable influence on climate change. When they approved Revolution Wind on their record of decision, they actually admit that the no action alternative would be better for the environment. But the reason why they're permitting this project is because it is going to help the industry. It's going to help support offshore wind industry. Now, I want you guys to know that the industry are fossil fuel companies. SouthCoast Wind is Shell. Ørsted is the Danish oil and natural gas. 33% of their profits last year were from burning coal. Equinor is Statoil, the Norwegian oil company. These are for-profit companies. I have no stake in this game. I'm not making billions of dollars, but the Inflation Reduction Act put aside $500 billion for these projects. There's a lot of money at stake, and they are not being honest with the public. And they're expecting you all to approve these and just lie down and take it and let Rhode Island's, resources and the ocean be at the subjugated by foreign oil companies. They have lied about climate change for decades. Why do we think they're going to be honest with us about all of these impacts? So anyway, thank you for letting me talk. I really appreciate it. I hope you will think about what I told you.
Any questions? What else?
Hello. My name is Charlotte Duhamel, GHL from Little Compton, Rhode Island. With the climate change summit going on right now, everyone's aware of what's happening. We all know what's happening. Actually, they have documents from the 1960s that show that telling them what was happening. Fossil fuel companies have shown again and again they're not good partners. The devastation in the Niger Delta is a prime example. In fact, 2 weeks ago, the High Court in London said that the plaintiffs, the villagers who are going to be able to bring suit against Shell for human rights crimes, this is not a good partner. SouthCoast, funded by Shell. Shell is a fossil fuel company. We know that they earn exorbitant profit, and they know that they've been contributing to climate change for decades. Also, it's very interesting that SouthCoast has been making deals that have not been open to the public to offer money to, for instance, the Montauk Golf Club in Portsmouth has offered $26 million to let the cables go through their property, and were offered $50,000 check that night if they sign. A lot of negotiations in the town of Portsmouth are being done behind closed doors. Why is that? Just some things to think about. Also, I do wonder how, without an FAB, how you're going to be getting that sort of input that you used to get from the FAB. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hello, my name is Laura Lee, L-E-E. I'm a resident of Little Compton, and I honestly had no intention of speaking tonight, but I did want to share a word. And I want to thank you for your public service. I think our life experiences do influence how we see things, and I was the daughter of a Congressman Geraldine Ferraro, and I know these late evenings are not easy, and I appreciate all your hard work. I'm also a pediatrician for 22 years, and I have a pretty happy job in general, but I will say a couple of times a year I have cases of leukemia and, tough cases. And in fact, I have a 7-year-old that got a stem cell transplant, a patient just on December 5th. And when you look into the eyes of a mother that has a kid with something like leukemia, you don't know where this comes from. And what I'm worried about, honestly, is not, I do care that, we'd be killing all these fish, but I'm actually worried about the fish that will survive, that will be eating the muck that comes up from 6 feet under that hasn't been tested. So I think that that's a major concern, and I just would ask all of you to think about your children and your grandchildren. And I'm going to assume positive intent on all sides here, but I think you need to think about some of those possible unintended consequences.
Anyone else wishes to speak? Is there anything you're closing in light of the comments?
I know nothing further, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman, Mr. Flynn.
Mr. Willis, it appears that many of the comments made have to do with the offshore wind project itself, as opposed to cable. And you clarify that the project itself, offshore, is not within our jurisdiction.
That's correct, Mr. Flynn, and I did note that as well with some of the commenters. The wind farm is a lease that is further south and east of 2018 GLD, therefore is not reviewable, by this council. What is reviewable by the council within a GLD for offshore wind projects are export cables. So this project's export cable that emanates outside of our GLD review jurisdiction finds its way into both of those GLDs. And therefore, the only review we have tonight under the federal consistency process is for the export cable and not the wind farm itself.
Just one other question. What is the opportunity for the public to weigh in on the BOEM approval or review of the project?
Sure. I would encourage everyone to go on to BOEM's website for this particular project and any other project that they're interested in. And BOEM has online ability for people to enter their comments on various parts of their BOEM federal review. So the FEIS, which is not out yet, but soon will have a comment period associated with it.
Why not? Something. I'd like to make a correction.
Until we close public comment, I'm sorry. Motions. Right, Mr. Izzy,
Based on the report of the staff, the testimony that we've heard tonight, comments in public, also find that the application meets the state's industrial policies with the conditions attached to the staff report.
And does that include the compensation that's been offered by the applicant?
Including the compensation. Proposal that was forwarded and dated December 6th, 2020.
Is there a second? Second on the security. And the superintendent will raise his hand.
Please repeat the motion. So the motion is to find the staff report and the testimony and evidence offered in favor of the application more credible than the testimony and evidence offered in opposition to it. We're finding that the project before you as described in the application and the testimony with the conditions contained in the staff report and the additional provision for compensation dated 12/6/23 is consistent with all Rhode Island enforceable policies, including those in the Ocean SAMP. And you're going to request that the executive director, communicate your concurrence with the appropriate federal authorities.
I would request that the motion be amended to conform with legal counsel's recitation.
And the seconds do the same. Yes. Yeah, Mr. Gagnon has anything to do as well. The motion has been made and seconded as stated in the discussion amongst the council. None of the council. Mr. Flynn.
Aye.
Ms. Izzy.
Aye.
Mr. Russolino.
Aye.
Ms. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Gagnon.
Aye.
Ms. Reynolds.
Aye.
2, and employer votes for May. Thank you. Well, take a couple minute recess. Just council. Zero 1199, the request for declaratory judge ruling of Lance and Holly Slater, Sheffield, CRMC, file number 2022-12-045 is before the council for review and action. At this time, I'm going to call on Attorney Hopman to brief the council as to a little bit of the travel of the case and our role this evening on this particular matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So tonight we have the Sheffields here. Sheffield's old property in Barrington. And on that property, there's a seawall as it is butts Narragansett Bay to the south. That seawall was provided a maintenance ascent in 1982. That particular ascent had a condition on it that required public access atop the riprap before the seawall. That ascent was not recorded in the land evidence records. The enforcement staff learned in 2021 of the fact that the Sheffields had blocked off access to the public portion of that riprap. Council enforcement staff issued a cease and desist order. The Sheffield subsequently petitioned the council for a declaratory ruling asking whether the assent is enforceable against them and accordingly that the cease and desist orders are appropriate. The argument that the Sheffields make is that the assent was not recorded in the land evidence records when it was issued in 1982. As a result, the Sheffields argue that the assent cannot be binding, as well as the public access condition on the Sheffields because they are subsequent purchasers of the property that were not aware of the condition when they purchased the property. The council, once they received the petition in December of 2022, was unable to hear the matter in a timely fashion. And as a result, it was appealed to the Superior Court on a declaratory judgment action pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act. The Superior Court determined that under state law, the council must hear the declaratory ruling that the Sheffield's petitioned the council for. That is why we're here tonight. Judge Lanphear has remanded the case to CRMC, and the council here has to determine whether, in fact, the assent is binding on the Sheffields, and as a result, the cease and desist orders, whether they're appropriate. So that is the procedural posture of this matter. And for a more detailed explanation of the facts behind this, I think the chair would hand it over to enforcement staff. But unless there are any questions for me at this moment, I would like to reserve some time for myself to address any arguments that the Sheffields make here tonight.
Any questions of our attorney at this point? Has the assent been filed or recorded in Barrington subsequent to any enforcement action?
No,
So it still remains unrecorded.
that's correct.
And whose obligations to record an assent?
The obligation is on the applicant for the assent. Yes, Ms. Hall.
But isn't it true that the year this was issued, that was not recorded? There was no burden.
That's absolutely true, Ms. Robbins Hall. At the time, there was no statutory requirement that the assent be recorded. Subsequently, the General Assembly in 1988 put into statute that an assent must be recorded. Now, when we can get into this later, I don't want to get into the weeds right off the bat. You know I like to do that. The assent, that 1988 statute doesn't have any indication that it's supposed to be retroactive. And under Rhode Island case law, generally, a statute, if it's going to be retroactive, it has to state it. Make a clear intent that it's retroactive. So if a applicant, came to the council before 88 and had a assent granted, they're not required under the statute to then go and have their assent recorded.
Then may I ask, when they came back for a repair after the statute, they were then back into the realm of modifying an assent? Is that what that was? The fact pattern, I'm not sure, I may have misunderstood, but it stated that they came back at some point in 2011, I believe, to repair the seawall. Since that was after the recording statute, even though it wasn't a new assent, having them back into the agency system, was there an effort at that time to have that recorded?
I am not familiar with those particular, I'm familiar with the 2011 assent, but as far as an effort to have that recorded.
Because that's after 1988.
Exactly.
So was that recorded?
That assent was not recorded.
Even though it was after 1988?
That's correct.
And I'm sorry, just to go back. In 1988, was there a responsibility laid on any particular party to record an assent?
I would have to get into the statute to make sure, but I believe that it is the responsibility of the applicant.
And prior to 1988, it was no one's responsibility to record an assent. Statutory under the statute.
Under the statute, that's correct.
Any other questions, Attorney Hartman? No, it's go to Brian, or do you want to say? All right. Code enforcement staff, Mr. Harrington, if you could just give us an update.
Sure. On September 17th, 2021, CRMC enforcement staff received a complaint that lateral access along the shore at 85 Nyack Road in Barrington was blocked by unauthorized fencing and signage on September 20th.
Sorry, you're gonna have to speak up a little
Okay,
bit.
sorry.
You were blocked by what, unauthorized?
Fencing and signage. On September 20th, 2021, CRMC staff conducted a site inspection and found that fences and signs had been constructed without an asset. On September 23rd, 2021, cease and desist order 21-0213 was issued to Lance and Holly Slater Sheffield for construction of 2 fences on a coastal feature and 2 signs within 200 feet of a coastal feature and for non-conformance with CRMC asset 1981-12-003 stipulations H and I. Subsequently, the Sheffield removed the signs and fences, and on September 27th, 2021, I cleared the cease and desist order in the database. On May 2nd, 2022, CRMC enforcement staff received a complaint that new signs were installed. A pole was installed with a siren on it, and a security guard was preventing lateral access along the shore, along the seawall. On May 3rd, 2022, CRMC staff conducted a site inspection and found that there was a security guard at the site attempting to prevent lateral access along the shore. On May 27th, 2022, CRMC cease and desist order 22-0094 was issued to Lance and Holly Slater Sheffield for preventing lateral public access along the top of the riprap retaining wall in non-conformance with CRMC asset 1981-12-003 stipulation E and additional stipulation H. The riprap retaining wall was constructed in non-conformance with the asset 1981-12-33 stipulation I. Specifically, the wall was constructed without the required 2-foot wide access path along the top of the riprap and failed to install and maintain a sign or plaque at each end of the riprap retaining wall clearly visible to the public, indicating that passage atop the riprap shall not be denied the public per order of CRMC. And the next thing that happened was the petition for the declaratory ruling.
Any questions of Mr. Harrington?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
I want to address Mr. Izzy's question. The particular statute that we're looking at is 46-23-21, notice of permit TAP recordation. And that statute states a notice of permit shall be eligible for recordation under Chapter 13 of Title 34 as determined by the executive director and shall be reported at the expense of the applicant in the land evidence records of the city or town where the property subject to permit is located. And any subsequent transferee of the property shall be responsible for complying with the terms and conditions of the permit. The clerk of the various cities and towns shall record any orders, findings, or decisions of the council at no expense to the council. Yes, Ms. Hall.
Does that include maintenance? Certificate of maintenance? Or just permits?
I would leave that up to the discretion of the staff on that. So I would ask either the executive director or Mr. Harrington.
Sure.
Yes, maintenances are also recorded on deed.
And who reports them ordinarily?
Same process. The applicant is responsible to record them.
Yeah, I mean, I heard the statute. It didn't clarify my question as to whether the statute made a particular party responsible to report. It just says the clerk will record an assent or a permit when it's presented to the clerk for recording, and says if CRMC presents the assent, we don't get, or the CRMC does not get charged for that recording. But it doesn't say the CRMC has to record the assent or the applicant has to record the assent.
So
Is there anything else that clarifies that? Or do we have a rule or regulation that says?
It's a standard stipulation that in the vast majority of assents that are issued, one of the standard stipulations is the applicant shall record this assent in the town's land evidence records within 30 days.
And that begs the question. Was that stipulation in the assent that affects the Sheffield's property?
Not in the 1988 one. We did not have that requirement at that point in time. 82, sorry. 82.
And what about the 2011?
I don't know the answer to that. What?
Well, the 2011 was a CRMC maintenance certificate. And if the recordation statute applies to maintenance, then do we know if we received, you know, how you get the confirmation from the land evidence record when something's been recorded? Did the agency receive that from the 2011 maintenance?
I don't have that information.
If I may.
Oh, yes,
Sure.
Yeah. that's what, yeah.
Brian's looking at right now, but it's my understanding that the 2011 maintenance assent was not required to be recorded in the land evidence records, so it was not.
Laura, was that it was not required or that stipulation was not on the?
Oh, there was no stipulation.
But it was required by the law, but just not included in that certificate? Because the
Not
law
all.
required it.
Not all assets are required to be recorded in the land evidence records.
And if I can clarify that for minor activities, maybe you're replacing a deck railing on your deck. We wouldn't necessarily require that maintenance type of activity be recorded. So like I mentioned before, the vast majority of all assets are recorded on land evidence records. But in this particular case, I guess a decision was made that that one did not have to be.
So when it says a notice of permit shall be eligible for recordation, and you said earlier maintenance is included,
It is.
not all maintenance is included?
Well, apparently the decision was made that that maintenance was not needed
Is
to
there
be
like a
recorded.
category of maintenance that, or is it?
Not necessarily, no. I don't know why that one was not.
Further questions? See some attorneys chomping to get going. You could just identify yourself for the record, please.
Certainly. Good evening, Chair Koya, Executive Director Willis, members of the council. My name is Dan Procaccini, and I am an attorney from Adler, Pollock and Sheehan, representing the petitioners who are here to my left this evening, Holly Slater Sheffield and Lance Sheffield. With me as well as my colleague, Stephen Payton. We appreciate the opportunity to be before the council this evening. My understanding, Mr. Sisto and Mr. Hartman, is that all of the prior filings that the Superior Court were provided to the council in advance of the hearing and are part of the record. That includes not only our legal arguments, but affidavits from Ms. Sheffield and Mr. Sheffield, an affidavit from our expert, Christopher Montalbano, who is a title attorney and title examiner, as well as my attorney affidavit attaching certain documents. With the chair's permission, I would like to add 3 documents to the record this evening. The first 2 are the title examination that was done before the Sheffields purchased the property. The other is just a copy for the record of the slide deck this evening.
Defer to you, Kelly.
And Mr. Procaccini, were these documents submitted 7 days prior to this meeting?
They weren't, because we received notice, I think last Monday or Tuesday that this meeting was being held tonight. I appreciate that that is due most likely to the Superior Court's order that required the council to respond in writing to this petition within 20 days. But that's why they weren't provided in advance.
Understood. Under 1.5.8 of our management procedures, because these weren't submitted 7 days prior, we can't take them. But your testimony tonight can speak to those, or the testimony for your clients, as well as your own representation can speak to those documents.
Sure, not just as the chair, under the circumstances of this particular proceeding, to note our objection to the lack of acceptance of those for the record.
So noted.
This petition, as I think the council has probably gotten already a flavor for, is unusual. And the history of this property is unusual. So with that in mind, it's my intention to walk through relatively briefly tonight the history of the property, of this dispute, and of our analysis of the law. And to ask Ms. Sheffield to provide brief testimony to supplement her affidavit in this case. And of course, we're happy to answer any questions from the council. I'd also like to thank the staff for assisting us with the technology this evening, which may be a little difficult to see, but I was unaware of the bring your own screen requirement for tonight, but I'll note that for the future. Our petition to the council asks essentially one question, which is whether a 30-year-old unrecorded CRMC assent 1981-12-003 is enforceable against purchasers of property who lack any actual or constructive knowledge of its existence. The Sheffields believe the answer to that question is no, and as a result, the restrictive condition that requires public access to their seawall is not enforceable, and any cease and desist orders that remain related to that requirement should be vacated. There are four principles that lead to this conclusion. The first is that predecessors entitle to the Sheffields, neither their immediate not their immediate predecessor entitled, but the Kilmarks family obtained the assent in 1982. Second, that as the council has already heard, the assent was not recorded in the land evidence records. Third, that the Sheffields had no actual knowledge of the assent when they purchased the property. And lastly, that they performed reasonable due diligence during the purchase consistent with professional standards. The easiest way to really understand what happened here is to understand the history of the property. On the left of this slide, you can see the original orientation of 85 Nayef Road, which is to the north and 56.
Hold on one second. Do you guys want to come up here?
I'll just walk around.
So you can see, I mean, it's an empty chair here if one of you want to come.
Mr. Chair, I realize it may not be accepted for the record, but we do have hard copies of the slide deck, if simply as an aid. Members
defer to council.
To refer to them.
I'm weird to do that. I think we can rely on the projector if I have to impose on Mr. Izzy.
Yeah,
Mr. Flynn.
come say here. Thank you. Please go ahead.
To the left is the original orientation of the properties that are at issue. 85 Nayef Road was to the north. 56 Elm was to the south and bordering on the bay. Elm Street is to the west, Nayef is to the north. And that is more or less how the properties looked until about 2017 when there was a subdivision made. And then in May 2021, the new 85 Nayef was sold to the Sheffields. That is what is depicted on the right. 56 Elm is still below to the south, bordering partially on the bay. It was subdivided by the prior owner, Mr. Goulden. As the council has already heard, the assent at issue came about from a December 3rd, 1981 application filed by the prior owners of 56 Elm, Robert and Mary Kilmarks. The seawall itself appears to have pre-existed the Kilmarxes. It's estimated to have been built in the 1950s, in fact, prior to CRMC's existence. And they applied to CRMC for a permit to repair the wall, 285 feet, actually, of the existing seawall. That application included these diagrams and proposed to repair the seawall by adding a layer of riprap armor stone that would include, quote, a 2-foot wide flat lateral access walkway for the public along the top of the riprap for about 285 feet, which is shorter than the length of the total seawall. The assent was granted in January 1982, and the primary relevant stipulations that bring us here this evening, as Mr. Harrington noted earlier, are H and I. H provides that a sign will be placed at each end of the riprap indicating that passage is open to the public, and I requires that the riprap will be constructed so that it is readily passable. I'll note for the council that there is no evidence in the record that this condition or either of these conditions were ever complied with by the Kilmarxes. Even if they were, and you'll hear this from Ms. Sheffield, it was not in this condition at the time they purchased the property, meaning there were no signs, there was no 2-foot wide passable or area for passage on top of the riprap. This is a picture of the seawall and the riprap as it exists today. It's a little hard to see given the light, but those are very large armor stones, most of which are covered at high tide, and it is a relatively steep drop off of the seawall onto the rocks below. The salient point in all of this discussion about the 1982 assent application is really that it was not recorded in the land evidence records. I agree with the vast majority of Mr. Hartman's factual and procedural summary at the beginning of the hearing this evening. There is no dispute that this assent was not recorded in the land evidence records. We have submitted, well, I can represent to you and you'll hear from Ms. Sheffield directly that their title examination, which they performed in advance of purchasing the property, did not uncover the assent precisely because it was not reported. And Mr. Montalbano's affidavit, which is in the record, explains why that was consistent with professional title standards and that a title examiner would not go beyond the land evidence records to records of individual agencies in order to determine whether there was ever any action taken by an agency relative to the property. That is consistent with the statute that Ms. Hall was referencing earlier, which requires at this point permits issued by CRMC to be recorded in the land evidence records, because that is where people look in this state to understand restrictions or interests in their property. To briefly touch on the balance of the history of this property with CRMC, as was noted at the outset, there was a 2011 maintenance application by the Kilmarxes to repair loose concrete on the existing seawall. That certification was granted by the council. The certification does candidly make reference to some public use of the seawall, but as was noted earlier, that maintenance certification was also never recorded in the land evidence records. Whether it was required to be or not, it wasn't there, and the Sheffields didn't know about it. That brings us all the way to 2017, in which there was a maintenance certification for 56 Elm Lane that was requested by Mr. Goulden, the Sheffield's immediate predecessor in title. That maintenance certification concerned knocking down a house that was on that piece of land at the time. It makes no reference to the seawall, to the riprap, to any stipulations of public access. It does not reference the prior maintenance certification. It does not reference the 1982 assent. It was, however, recorded. That is the only CRMC permit that was recorded for this property. And that permit actually mentions that failure to comply with the recording provision will render it null and void. That brings us all the way to May 2021, when the Sheffields acquired the property. As you've already heard at length, a title examination did not show that any assents other than the 2017 assent had been issued. And I submit that the Sheffields did everything a reasonable purchaser of this property would do. In addition to a full title examination, they had a land survey done by a professional engineer. That is in the information that is before the council this evening as well. And that survey doesn't note any public access requirement across the seawall. It is simply part of their private property. They reviewed the deeds in the chain of title, which say nothing about public access to the seawall. And they, of course, spoke to the seller, to the seller's real estate agent, to his attorneys, none of whom appear to have even been aware of the assent that was issued in 1982. There is no evidence in the record that anyone other than the Kilmarxes themselves knew that that assent had been issued. You'll hear from Ms. Sheffield that after purchasing the property, they observed members of the public using their seawall to sightsee, to fish, to traverse along the water at all times of day and night. And you'll hear that that is not a small number of people, and it intrudes on their feelings of safety and security with respect to their property. As newer Rhode Islanders, perhaps unaware of the breadth of CRMC's regulations, you heard from Mr. Harrington about some of the conduct they took to try and deal with this issue. I think the important thing to know is that the signs have been removed, the fencing was removed, so those issues no longer presently exist. However, we do still have, of course, the dispute about whether the public is allowed to be there at all. So this is our argument this evening, that the 1982 assent is unenforceable with respect to 85 Nant Road and the Sheffields. And that is based on Rhode Island law. The request boils down to what is considered legally sufficient fair notice of an encumbrance on a property. It is a tried and true principle that someone who buys property without actual or constructive notice of an encumbrance like the assent and its public access requirement is known as a bona fide purchaser. Those restrictions or encumbrances cannot be enforced against such a purchaser. So whether the assent is characterized as a permit or as imposing an easement or a public access requirement, it is irrelevant. There is no law that we have found in the state of Rhode Island that distinguishes between any of those things under what's known as the bona fide purchaser rule. It was through no fault of the Sheffields. I submit it was through no fault of CRMC. The Kilmarxes nor anybody else ever recorded this thing. Nobody knew about it until a complaint was made to CRMC, who dug into its own files, found it, and issued the cease and desist letters that ultimately brought us here this evening. So to summarize, the 1982 assent was not recorded. It was not uncovered by the more than reasonable pre-purchase due diligence. The Sheffield's predecessor in title never disclosed it. Nothing around the seawall itself suggests the existence of a right of public access. There are no placards, there are no signs, and nothing about the seawall or the immediate area itself discloses that there would be a right of public access. So for all those reasons, we believe the Sheffields are entitled to the full benefit of the bona fide purchaser rule, and that the council should issue a decision declaring that this assent is null and void. Happy to answer any questions now, or to have you hear from Ms. Sheffield.
Any questions of Attorney Procaccini at this point?
Yeah, just to clarify, the 2017 maintenance certification.
Yes.
And what property was that for? Was
So that was for 56 Elm. Part of 56 Elm has become part of 85 Nant. So the title examination was done for both.
Okay. In 2017, were both properties still a single lot?
No, I believe they were separate. It depends when in 2017. I think that's when the subdivision occurred. But at one
I'm
point-
interested in when the 2017 maintenance certification was approved.
Sitting here tonight, I don't know relative to the subdivision, when the maintenance certification was made. I can tell you,
It's kind of important for my analysis.
if I could just have a moment, I can probably answer your question.
Sure.
So the maintenance certification was issued in August 24th of 2017. And the subdivision.
If I may, that was, the subdivision was approved, and I don't want to intrude on you.
No, go ahead.
The subdivision was approved by the Barrington Planning Board on September 29th, 2017.
So after the maintenance assent. And if I could just clarify, since it came up earlier with respect to the 1988 statute, we haven't taken the position that the statute is retroactive to 1982. I think there are good grounds to say it would apply to the maintenance assent, but the issue here is really about fair notice and what is sufficient notice under the law. So we have not made an argument that the statute is itself retroactive.
Ms. Hall?
I have a question regarding that notice. The 2017 maintenance certificate was maintenance of a seawall.
No,
What was it of maintenance of?
the 2017 maintenance certification was to demolish a single family home that was at 56 Elm.
Okay, so it was jurisdictional activity
Correct.
relative to CRMC. And that did not. So I guess, just thinking about constructive notice or any notice at all relative to the awareness, I mean, you mentioned casually about lack of the notice of the breadth of CRMC's jurisdiction, which is really not relevant. Obviously, there's jurisdiction in this property. There's a maintenance certificate recorded in 2017 from the agency that regulates coastal activity. So I'm just sort of pondering your statement about there'd be no way they would possibly move the breadth of the agency's jurisdiction. That just can't be true.
Let me clarify the purposes, what I intended by that statement, which was the fact that they erected a chicken wire fence and put up a sign, a permanent sign within 200 feet of a coastal feature. I don't think they were well versed in the regulations that CRMC would have with respect to that. I don't think there is any law in the state of Rhode Island that says because you own waterfront property, it is incumbent upon you to make an independent inquiry of this agency to see whether they have ever taken any activity that has resulted in a restrictive covenant on your property.
But how is that any different than if you are purchasing property and you know there's freshwater wetlands on the property? You're obligated to understand that you have standing water on your property, that it's regulated, and that is within the realm of Rhode Island law, that you are on constructive notice, that you have environmental features on your property that are more likely than not regulated.
I don't think this is a question of whether they had legal notice that CRMC could regulate the area of their property that is subject to its jurisdiction. This is about whether they had notice of a restrictive covenant that allowed public access. And there's nothing about the fact that they have a seawall that predates CRMC's existence, that suggests that CRMC imposed a public access restriction. So I think there's a distinction in the point you're making respectfully between the general idea of constructive notice that an agency might have some regulatory authority over your property and specific notice of a specific restriction on your property.
But leave aside that for a moment, and relative to public access, generally, there's a lot of ways public access can be effectuated alongside or over or across private property. And you wouldn't need a recorded deed, for example, for your clients to be on notice that, for example, there was a prescriptive easement alongside their property, or there was an implied easement, a implied consent, a dedicated easement found in common law. So you wouldn't need a deed for your clients to be on notice of the existence of a chronically used, I mean, from your own testimony, and you stated we'll hear more about the amount of use. There is an obligation to be put on notice as to the use of property, and you don't need a recorded deed to have been aware of that. That's part of the bargain, is that you have to be on notice that those conditions could exist on your property, particularly if you're adjacent to a public resource like the ocean or the coast.
So I, again, respectfully, strongly disagree. The statutes in Rhode Island require any instrument or that is pertaining to an interest in property to be recorded in the land evidence records. I appreciate the point you're trying to make is with respect to a prescriptive easement or an implied easement in which has never been declared with respect to this property. And the state would have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence in a court of law that that seawall had been used regularly, hostilely, which it can't prove because there was an assent with respect to the kill marks that consented to it to create a prospective easement. The Sheffields didn't own the property, couldn't have possibly observed that until after they purchased it. So I don't think under the standard, which is asked to be so significant a fact that it would warrant additional investigation, that could possibly satisfy the constructive notice requirement.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that this is a prescriptive easement, although it might be. I'm suggesting that in those conditions, landowners are obligated to be on notice of that. That's their due diligence responsibility. So not a matter of whether you prove the elements of hostile open and all the rest. It's a matter of being on notice that that's a possibility that you would notice. And by your own words, you said it's extensively used. So that's all. I'm not trying to suggest that it's the state's trying to prove whether or not this is a prescriptive easement or not.
Yeah, I disagree that there's any evidence in the record before the council that the Sheffields themselves had any notice sufficient to constitute construction. But I appreciate it.
Mr. Gagnon.
The question, so under the new shoreline access law passed last year?
This year.
Property or the area within 10 feet of mean high water is passable to the public. So wouldn't the top of this wall, which surely looks like it's within 10 feet of mean high water, be under the new law passable to the public?
If I may, Mr. Chair. No, the statute specifically calls out where shorelines are impassable by legally constructed, otherwise CRMC assented structures that you cannot walk up over someone's private property to continue along that 10-foot path, if you will. So in this particular case, absent this whole issue, if this issue was not here at all, someone walking along that shore found themselves within the 10-foot above the seaweed line or above the wet sand line, they can't walk on someone's assented structure.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Flynn.
Are you familiar with the requirements of a seller in the Real Estate Disclosure Act? Real estate disclosure.
Yeah, in a general sense, I'm not a real estate transactional.
Well, I bought my house fairly recently, so and I pulled out. But my seller had to fill out, and it's very short, I'll read it to you. Seller is legally required to provide the buyer with a copy of any previous surveys of the property and documentation of conservation and/or preservation easements and restrictions that are in the seller's possession, and notify the buyer of any known easements, encroachments, covenants, or restrictions of the seller's property. Now, I understand your contention that the Sheffields were not aware of this, and so I assume that was not shown to them in their transaction.
Great.
And it's possible that Mr. Golden, who they bought the property from, was not aware of it. But would you agree that the Kilmarxes, when they sold the property to Golden, would have been under an obligation to inform that buyer of those restrictions?
So, 2 points of clarification. There's an intermediate owner who is Mr. Faxon, between the Kilmarxes and Mr. Golden. I don't know.
But that name didn't show up in any of the stuff that we.
Sure, and but that's a small point, just in the sense that that's how much distance
we do
there
know
is
the name
between between them. And I don't know if the statute that controls those disclosures was in effect at the time, but based on what you've read, I would say yes, the Kilmarxes would have probably had an obligation to disclose it. I don't know if they did. It certainly did not appear in any of the title documents. It was not disclosed to the Sheffields with respect to their sale.
Well, if they did, then a subsequent buyer would also have been required to disclose that to the next buyer.
Correct. If the statute was in effect and applied, I agree with that.
Okay.
Yes, Ms. Reynolds.
So I understand that this was not recorded and it wasn't required in the 1980s. But there are a lot of other things that affect a property that aren't necessarily recorded. And I work for a municipality, and I know very often people who are going to purchase a house come in to speak to us about zoning regulations. And I would imagine if you're buying a property on the water, you may want to contact CRMC to sort of check and see what the regulations are and if there's any outstanding or any other information. Do you know if the applicants or the Sheffields contacted CRMC or did any of that due diligence as part of their purchase?
So I know CRMC was first contacted, I believe, and Ms. Sheffield can correct me if I'm wrong, with respect to the property after they saw the people walking across this seawall, which raised a question in their mind about what was going on. They contacted, I believe it was Tracy Silva at CRMC, who told them that that was their private property. They also contacted the Barrington tax assessor, who told them the same thing. With respect to the question of whether CRMC was contacted as part of the pre-sale due diligence, I think the answer to that question is no. I don't believe there's any requirement that we have found in Rhode Island law that would make it reasonable for a purchaser in the context of a real estate transaction to have to reach out to any agency that could potentially regulate the property or have regulated it in the past. For example, in this case, they could reach out to CMC. They could also reach out to the Coast Guard. They could reach out to the harbor master. They could call FAA and see whether a navigation easement was ever put over the property. And I don't think the law requires that in the context of the bona fide purchaser rule.
Ms. Lizzie.
Council, I just want to drill down on what I think are your arguments at this hearing. And just correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the arguments that you're making is with respect to the cease and desist order. And your contention is that it's not fair to punish or sanction the Sheffields for violating a provision of an assent of which they were not previously aware.
I think that's
fair enough.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So that's one of the arguments and one of the things that the council has to decide. But I've heard a second argument that you're making, which is that the 1982 assent is not valid, should be voided by the council,
should be ignored and it should go away and not be part of the bundle of rights and obligations that the Sheffields purchased with 85 Nayet Avenue. And I mean, if the assent goes away, they can't have it both ways, right? The permission to put the riprap wall also goes away, correct?
Well, they didn't ask for permission to put the riprap wall.
But the only reason it's there is because there's an assent
Because of an assent,
from
yes.
CRMC. So if the assent goes away, then the permission to maintain the wall goes away.
So I think it is a question of enforceability. So the restriction, which is you must allow the public to traverse your seawall, goes away because that's an encumbrance on the Sheffields to their detriment. It can't be enforced against them. I don't think it requires voiding to the assent. I am reading into perhaps what you're saying, that they could be forced to remove the wall or the riprap if the assent were to be voided, and I don't think that's the case, or it's not necessary, I should say, with respect to the restriction on their property.
It's a necessary consequence. And so you're saying we should blue line the assent and just take out the parts the Sheffields don't agree with and leave the good stuff in?
No, the council doesn't have to do anything. It's just not allowed to enforce that particular restriction. It is unenforceable. It doesn't have to be, the assent doesn't have to be voided, but it should declare that that restriction, requirement, easement, whatever it is classified as, is not enforceable as the Sheffield.
But you see the point that I'm making is
I do.
You may have, and this is just me talking. You may have an argument that, gee, you shouldn't punish them because they weren't aware of those requirements in the assent when they were cited for violating them. Right?
I agree with that.
Okay. Now they're aware of the conditions in the assent.
Sure.
Okay. So.
But they were not at the time they purchased the property, and I think you will hear they would not have purchased the property had they known of that at the time, and the law does not permit, this is, and I appreciate this is why one of the reasons this petition is so unusual to be before this body in this context. The law does not permit the council to enforce that stipulation against people in the Sheffield's position. Usually,
and again, just be clear. Do you mean in 2021 or forever?
To enforce the public access requirement against the Sheffields forever.
Okay.
Absent some other event.
Any further questions? Mr. Flynn?
So when the Sheffields discovered that there were people walking along the seawall, which I assume happened pretty quickly after they moved in, did they ever go back to the prior property owner and say, hey, what's going on with this? Because I would assume that people have been walking along that seawall during the time that Mr. Golden, or whoever the prior property owner was, owned the property. This didn't just start in 2021.
I don't know whether the question was asked. I could have Ms. Sheffield answer that, but my understanding is that Mr. Golden was not frequently at the property.
What does that mean?
That he only lived there a couple of weeks a year.
So what does that mean?
That if they were to ask him, he might not have been able to answer.
Well, you don't know that.
I don't know the answer because
The answer is they didn't ask.
I have to ask Ms. Sheffield to address that.
Any other questions?
Can I point something out?
Yes, Mr. Harrington.
It's my, I just want to comment on why the public access was required in the first place. It is my understanding that the riprap that was proposed was below mean high water and would block existing lateral access along the shore.
CRMC staff at the time was concerned about this and the impacts to public trust resources and recommended access be moved to the top of the riprap wall. This is for background.
Okay, thank you.
I just, I'm going to move back to my seat if you're done with your
Yes.
presentation. Oh, thank you.
Any other questions at this point?
I just have one last.
Yes, Ms.
question.
Reynolds.
Does this access along the riprap wall extend beyond their property lines? Like, is there a
So
way
there-
to pass?
To be clear, the access along, there is no access along the riprap because it was either never properly constructed or the riprap shifted in such a way that the access was removed. People have walked across the seawall instead. It's my understanding that the enforcement staff has taken the position that if the riprap isn't accessible, we should be able to walk across the seawall. The restriction as to the Sheffield's property, well, it only applies to 56 Elm and what now is part of their property that was part of 56 Elm. If there are other properties that have similar access restrictions or requirements, they're sort of individually pieced together. It's my observation, having looked at the wall, that it seems as though many folks in that area have obstructions on their wall. So if that is accurate, then the public is not able to walk down that area.
I now have a question because of something you said. I'm
What
looking,
happens when I talk?
I'm looking at the judicial decision, so I'm just looking at this language here. And it says the 1982 assent authorized a 2-foot wide public access walkway on top of a riprap retaining wall. Is that not there anymore? The riprap retaining
The
wall?
riprap is there, yes.
Okay,
The question is really whether someone could walk across it in the manner that is.
but it's still there.
It is still.
Okay. Further questions? I think you want to question Ms. Sheffield, so
For the.
well, we're gonna have her sworn in, please.
Yes. Ms. Sheffield, would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Do.
Would you please state and spell your name for the record?
Holly Sheffield, SHEFFIELD, and it's Holly with a Y.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, for the sake of efficiency, I ask Ms. Sheffield to just prepare a brief narrative statement as opposed to question and answer.
That's fine.
Permissible.
As I stated before, my name is Holly Sheffield and I'm joined this evening by my husband, Lance Sheffield. We own the property at 85 Nant Road in Barrington, which we purchased in May of 2021. We are both business owners who grew up in the Northeast and moved to Houston, Texas many years ago. After living for years in a large city, raising 5 children, we decided that when we became empty nesters, we would move back to the Northeast, aspiring to buy a waterfront home. We were very discerning in our search for a new home. First and foremost, we were looking for a home that would provide an overall sense of calm and peace. We were looking for a private, safe home large enough to accommodate our family. The property we purchased on Nant Road satisfied all of these expectations. When we purchased our home, we performed substantial diligence. Neither the title search nor the deed indicated the existence of any assent or right of access concerning our seawall. We also commissioned a land survey of the property by a professional engineer. The survey showed that the seawall was part of our property and did not indicate any right of access by the public. There was no signage on the seawall that we observed at any time indicating that the public had a right of access. No one, including the seller, his agent, or his attorneys, told us about the CRMC assent. We had no knowledge whatsoever of any ascent or right of access to our seawall. Shortly after we purchased the property, however, we noticed people regularly traversing along our seawall at all hours of the day and night. People were fishing off the seawall, remnants of a campfire along with beer bottles, trash strewn along the entire area. We were also concerned about the safety of these individuals. The seawall is narrow and is a steep drop into sharp and dangerous rocks below that are most obscured during high tide. Based on our observations, my husband Lance contacted the Barrington Police Department, the tax assessor's office, and CRMC. The tax assessor assured us that our property included the seawall. With conviction, Tracy from CRMC stated that the seawall was our private property. She suggested contacting the tax assessor, which we already had done. Tracy said she would have Brian Harrington call Lance back to corroborate what she was saying. Brian never called us back. When we did not hear back from Brian Harrington or anyone else from CRMC, we put up 2 temporary chicken fences and private property signs to deter the public from traversing across our seawall. When we received CRMC's written cease and desist order related to the fence, that was the first time we learned about the Ascent 1981-12-003. The cease and desist order requested we remove the fence and signs, at which time we did, although briefly kept the signs up out of a concern for our personal liability in the event of an injury. They were ultimately permanently removed. In August 2022, a front page article was written in the Barrington Times about this issue. The article had many inaccuracies and falsifications. The article led to people harassing us and spewing hate speech on Nextdoor, Facebook, and Reddit, as well as vandalizing our property. Security, privacy, and peace of mind are of utmost importance to our family. We would not have purchased this property had we known it was allegedly accessible to the public in this way. We appreciate the council's time this evening, and we ask that you approve our petition, and under these unusual circumstances, find that the assent is unenforceable. Thank you.
Any questions, Ms. Sheffield? Mr. Flynn?
At what point in the process did you hire a security guard and install the alarm? When was that?
The alarm is also a camera.
Was that after the first sign and fence?
No, I
had
believe
come
it
down,
was before.
or before that?
I think it was
Or
before.
concurrent with that?
I believe so.
So at the same time, you put in the fence and the no trespassing signs?
I believe we put the camera in first.
No,
Unless
no,
you-
no, I'm sorry.
I'm
sorry, my name is Lance. I'm sorry.
Oh, yes.
That's okay. We'll swear you in, but you can comment.
Sorry, Mr. Sheffield. If you please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Would you please spell and state and spell your name for the record?
Lance, Lance, Sheffield, Sheffield. Mr. Flynn, so I put the chicken fence in first and the no trespassing signs. And the first time I put the signs in, I actually had them in a 5-gallon bucket with some sand. And then the second time, I actually just hammered them down into the dirt. So they weren't completely, there was no concrete in the dirt or anything like that. But then afterwards, I installed the camera, which is on just a 4x4 post. There's no concrete in the ground whatsoever.
And the security guard and the alarm?
The security guard, well,
the alarm is part of the camera.
The camera system is part of the alarm. It senses human activity. The security guard came after we had half-naked woman coming onto the seawall and she's taking selfies of herself, you know, with the property in the background. So that was kind of the, you know, big red flag. Not to mention, we've had several kids, like Holly mentioned, you know, partying down at the seawall at night, like at midnight.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Okay, anything else, council?
No, Mr. Chair.
Attorney Hartman, you wanna?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
I hate to belabor the point because I think the council's asked some great questions tonight, and this is going to be a little bit repetitive. But I just want to kind of outline our memo of legal counsel's position on this matter. So we've heard about actual and constructive notice and encumbrances, conveyances. And I want to just kind of unpack these things a little bit. Let's start with notice. So we have actual notice, we have constructive notice. I think that our position is that we set aside actual notice. We trust the affidavits provided by the Sheffields, and we don't contest those. So actual notice, we can set aside. That raises the question of, well, is there constructive notice of the government permit that was on the property? Legal counsel's position is that there likely was. There's particular case law that goes to constructive notice. And if I can beg the patience of the council, essentially the constructive notice case law is found under Sousa v. Town of Coventry. That's 774 Atlantic 2nd 812 at 815. In the doctrine, this is what the court says: the doctrine should be applied cautiously and only where one has acquired knowledge of facts that are so suggestive of the existence of an ultimate fact that a reasonably prudent person would be moved to investigate and ascertain the ultimate fact. So I think one of the questions that the council has to wrestle with tonight is there evidence on the record that would show a fact that was suggestive so that the petitioner would have been led to the ultimate fact? Is the existence of a seawall on a property something that should have compelled the petitioner prior to their purchase of the property to go to CRMC, request the documents that CRMC had? And again, these are public documents. Under an APA request, these are required to be produced to a requester after before the end of 10 business days. And in these documents, and this is outlined in our memo, there are a number of statements made in various other maintenance assents, in other documents that the agency has with regard to this matter about how this property was used for public use. So the question is there constructive notice in that case? Is that a fact that leads to another fact that leads to the fact that there was this condition on the assent? So that's constructive notice. Again, we set aside actual notice. But that's kind of playing in this box right here, where we're assuming that this is the same law that is subject to reporting, the recording statutes, because this is as a private conveyance would have been. The private conveyances are subject to recording statutes because the state is worried about, let's say, sleeper encumbrances. That's something that private parties make some sort of easement, some sort of deal between each other that they're going to use the particular properties in a certain way. The concern is, how is a subsequent purchaser supposed to know about this private deal? Well, the only way they can really know is if it's recorded in the land evidence records. That puts the public at large on notice that there's something going on with this property. But again, this is for private conveyances. This is for private encumbrances. What we have here isn't a private conveyance. There's no sleeper conveyance here. This is a government document that could have been uncovered readily with an APA request. So that's part of the aspect of, this is a government permit and we're not talking about private conveyances. A couple other points I want to address that were brought up during the discussion tonight. There was some discussion about, well, again, this goes to constructive notice. If a party has to reach out to various government agencies in order to uncover these conveyances, are they required to do that? Well, I think the Coast Guard was mentioned, but there's no facts in this case to suggest that a Coast Guard action had been taken on this property. You know, perhaps if there was, an oil sheen on the property, then it would have been reasonable to inspect Coast Guard records. Now, I'm not going to analogize an oil sheen to a seawall. I'm going to leave that up to the council, but that is it's a little bit of a distinction there, I think. The analogy that you're making, I think is imperfect between Coast Guard and CRMC. Now, I'll also note that during Ms. Sheffield's testimony, she had mentioned that Ms. Tracy Silva was contacted, but this occurred after the Sheffields have purchased the property. So I think I know that mitigates against CRMC's position, but again, this is after the property was purchased. So I don't think it's as poignant here. Now, the last thing I want to mention is there could be a potential floodgates issue here. There's a question of how many other permits do we have throughout the state, just in Barrington, that were issued by CRMC prior to 1988 and that weren't recorded, and what happens to those permits at this point. So I think that the council should be wary of that issue as well. Other than that, I'm going to leave my comments there. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. And also I'll provide a posture going forward, how the council is poised to move on this action.
I'd like to hear that.
Mr. Coy, may I respond briefly to Mr. Hartman? I don't want to repeat our papers, but I think
there might be a question from Ms. Hall. Did you have a question, Mr. Attorney Hartman?
I really want to know what exactly it is the council is being asked to do tonight relative to the declaratory ruling before we hear any further commentary or rebuttal or anything else.
The council is to issue a declaration one way or the other on whether they believe that the assent is valid, and that includes the condition, and that can be based on the papers put forth by legal counsel, or alternatively, the council can determine that or make a declaration that the assent is not valid, particular to the condition placed on the property. There is a third option, and that's that the council could decline to issue an order and schedule the matter for further consideration.
What is your legal advice to the council specifically?
Well, I'm not in a position to provide what the...
Well, they provided what they would like us to do, and you're our legal counsel. So what is it that you've advised?
I think
it's consistent with your reply brief, but if you could just sort of synthesize.
Absolutely. So the legal counsel's position, and this is in accord with our brief, is that the assent is a government permit that does not need to be recorded to be valid in the first instance. But if it indeed has to be recorded, that there was constructive notice of the assent and condition sufficient to allow the cease and desist orders to be appropriate.
I have a question then of council. I agree with a lot of the enforcement argument by Attorney Parcassini, but my question is this. The facts indicate that in 1982, there was an assent issued. That assent gave them an opportunity to repair a wall, and with that, provide public access walkway on top of a riprap retaining wall. I have not seen or heard anything that extinguished the assent requirement that they have a 2-foot wide public access walkway on top of the riprap. Am I correct with that?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So I'm kind of making some rationale in my mind here. If they say, well, we didn't know we couldn't do that, so you shouldn't punish us. Totally get it. But it doesn't mean that what you did wasn't wrong. So as you admonish someone and you say, all right, I'll let it go this time, but don't do it again because you know you can't do it. It's still wrong what they're doing, because in my mind, and this is how I'm interpreting, whether I'm right or wrong with this, I'm seeing that law, that condition is still in existence as we sit here today. So I buy what they say about, I didn't know about it. We didn't know about it when we bought the property. No due diligence would have shown it. Okay, but it's still there. So I guess I'm kind of like digressing a little bit, but I guess my question, circling back, is there's nothing in existence that extinguished that requirement of the allowing the traversing over the wall. Am I correct?
Not that I'm aware of, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's shown anything to that. Okay. Mr. Flynn.
Mr. Hartman, would you agree that much of the discussion that we've had tonight, if the council were to affirm the assent and with conditions, that much of the discussion we've had tonight may very well end up back in Superior Court?
Yes.
100%.
Mr. Flynn? Thank you.
But isn't it true, it already has to go back based on the administrative appeal? I mean, the directions from the court was to us to handle this one piece. It's already going or has its own life based on the APA appeal.
My understanding is that there's going to be a review in 60 days and.
Right, regardless.
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I agree. The appeal remanded for the purposes that we are here tonight, and I think whatever decision the council makes is subject to a new appeal.
Right.
I agree.
Right. Yes, Mr. Gagnon.
Is there an option for the Sheffields to apply for a new assent for the wall? Request that condition no longer applies, especially since the wall is probably not in compliance with what was approved in 1982. It doesn't sound like that 2-foot shelf is at the top is even there anymore.
Mr. Gagnon, I hate to do it, and I hate to do it to Jeff, but I think I'm going to toss this one over to staff.
I thought it might be coming my way anyway. Everybody has a right to apply for whatever they want, whenever they want. I would suspect, I don't want to speculate on how we would review the matter, but we would look at the historical past record of of what happened on the property to where we are today, and then what's being requested. And what's being requested is essentially what we're here for tonight, is to remove a particular stipulation. But yes, they could apply.
Well, I'm just thinking that might be a more appropriate way to. I mean, I'm under the assumption that the permit is still in effect and that condition is still valid, which I kind of agree with. But the way to, I guess, one option to change that, the permit is to apply for a new permit.
Is to seek a modification to an assent.
That's it.
Anything else? Last words?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate Mr. Willis's comments and clarifications about alternatives. You know, I can discuss those with the Sheffields. I think one of the issues council's aware has been the timing of all of this, and that we did make some efforts to resolve this informally before filing our petition and subsequent appeal that were not successful. You know, perhaps there's always room for discussion. I do want to address very briefly a couple of points that Mr. Hartman raised, and Ms. Hall as well. The first is I want to be clear exactly what we're asking for. And this goes to the points the chair raised and Mr. Izzy and Ms. Hall, which is that a finding that the CRMC assent is unenforceable with respect to the petitioners, which is distinguishable from it is a nullity, which maybe we have thrown out colloquially, but that the terms that require them to permit public access cannot be enforced against the Sheffields versus the assent is simply wiped from the books. And the second would be that the cease and desist orders, to the extent they are still enforced, and I hear from Mr. Harrington, one of them may not be, that those be vacated because they are based on enforcing the assent. So that's what we've asked the council to do. With respect to Mr. Hartman's legal analysis, I know the council knows we disagree with that strongly. We don't believe there's any law that distinguishes between a government permit and anything else when it comes to the fair notice requirements that the common law establishes. I'll just note quickly that first, I think the legal analysis provided shifted the burden. So the burden is on the party who is trying to enforce the restriction, enforce the easement. Here, representing the public, that would be CRMC's enforcement staff. So that the staff would have had to give you evidence from which you could conclude that it was enforceable. It's not on the Sheffields to carry that burden. The second is that Mr. Hartman talked about sleeper encumbrances, and I submit respectfully, that is exactly what this assent is. It doesn't matter that it was with CRMC. It was an entitlement crafted for the public at large that the Sheffields could not have known anything about without going above and beyond what the law requires. Unless the council has other questions, I'll leave it there.
Any questions? Okay, motions, deliberations. Mr. Izzy. I will put a motion out. Okay. And hopefully telegraphed it with my questions. I would move based on the documents that we reviewed, specifically the filings from the Superior Court and the testimony of Mr. Harrington and the testimony from the Sheffields and arguments of counsel, that first, based on notions of fundamental fairness and due process, and the fact that the Sheffields were not aware of the restrictions and requirements of the 1982 assent before they were cited, that we dismiss the cease and desist orders that were issued in 2001 and 2002, to the extent they're still open. I think the one in 2001 was closed, correct?
2021?
Yeah. What did I say?
2001.
Yeah, all right. 2021.
Okay.
And
2022.
That one's resolved.
All right. Then we find that we dismiss the 2022 complaint. And as the second part of my motion, just so that this And no question as to where the council stands with respect to the 1982 assent. That we ratify and confirm that the 1982 assent remains in full force and effect from this time forward. I think I don't think it's within our purview to void the assent. I think it's still valid, but I don't think the council at this time should enforce those provisions of which the Sheffields were unaware when they were cited. Now that they have actual knowledge of the assent, everyone goes forward with the same understanding and will live with the assent. Is there a second?
I'll second for purposes of discussion, but I have a question.
Okay,
So
the motion, let me just say for the record, a motion has been made by Mr. Izzy and seconded by Mr. Flynn. Discussion.
So you're suggesting voiding the enforcement action, correct?
Dismissing
cease and desist.
Whatever's hanging out there.
Okay. So the next time someone walks across the right of way, the top of the riprap, the flat area, and is told that they're not supposed to be there, wouldn't there just be another cease and desist order?
Yes.
Okay.
There could be.
There could be. All right. Yeah. So, all right. Okay. I understand where he's going.
Would that now be subjected to recording?
Logically and practically, somebody should record the assent. Yes, I agree. I don't know if we're going to stand on ceremony or if we could just mail it to Barrington and I mean, CRMC staff, mail it to Barrington and say, record this for me. For us, for the CRMC. Ms. Wall?
I guess I see no world in which you purchase property in this decade or century where you're not required to pursue due diligence with respect to controlling laws on that property. In particular, relative to what is widely understood to be highly regulated natural resources. The ocean, the coast are highly regulated natural resources. That is absolutely without dispute, as is, other conditions on your property, which I mentioned earlier, standing water, running streams. This is not an issue for the Coast Guard, I agree. This is not an issue for the Food and Drug Administration. It's an issue relative to Rhode Island law. Rhode Island common knowledge is that the coast is a highly regulated natural resource. And that line, even just the line between private ownership and public trust rights on a developed piece of property, it should give you pause about how much do I own, to the point where you have to call the assessor. What do I own? What's mine? What's the public? And if you have a man-made structure in front of you, it didn't just drop in from nowhere. And that, again, even if you're on an undeveloped beach, you're on notice that you've got some restrictions. You would want to know what those restrictions were, just as the real estate disclosure requires you to not only talk about permits, but also disclose wetlands, disclose hazardous waste, disclose other highly regulated environmental conditions. There's a reason for that, right? Because they're real. And even if you were just on an undeveloped beach, you'd want to know, well, what are the limitations of my property? Because I am a riparian owner. I don't get everything that someone not adjacent to a public trust waterway would get. You're getting something different. Your title is different. Your ownership is different. Part of your ownership is in common with the general public. You'd want to find out from the regulating entity, what are my limitations here? Number one. And then number two, it's already been developed. There's already been something permitted. What are the conditions? What are the restrictions? Do I have to maintain this thing? Do I have to, what if I want to add cement? What if wouldn't you know, how would you not want to know that when you're investing in real estate? And I do agree it's constructive notice. I do agree that you're on notice, period, when you're next to a highly regulated public resource, especially a public resource, and also a man-made structure that was part of your property. So whether it's an issue with the prior property owners, that seems to be a civil matter that doesn't relate to us, relative to notice by prior property owners, feels like that's not our issue. I feel strongly like I am in agreement with legal counsel that constructive notice absolutely is, has been obtained, is real, is actively part of this negotiation, and that the assent is valid, no question about that. And that, whether or not CRMC wants to settle these enforcement matters is on them, but I think it really undermines our position to retroactively record something that wasn't required to be recorded because of the issue that council represents with respect to Pandora's box. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of assets out there that have pre-88 that have not been recorded. Are all of those not valid? Are all of those not subject to enforcement actions? Every time someone goes on one of those permits and does a little something, oh, well, this can set a pretty, I would say, dangerous precedent of undermining our enforcement mission. And our enforcement mission relative to upholding these assents is really important for the integrity of the coastline, for the integrity for the sake of the property owners and for the sake of the public. So I respect you trying to really figure out a way to, give a little, take a little, but I think it undermines probably, just dozens and hundreds and thousands of permits that are out there. And it undermines our enforcement capacity if we say, let's cut the baby and retroactively record this. It undercuts our argument that it's constructive notice as well. So I agree with legal counsel.
Mark, can you just state the motion again? That's already been seconded, so we have some clarity on that for the record.
I'll state my understanding of it and confirm with Mr. Izzy. I believe it's a declaration that the cease and desist orders that are now still active are no longer, or the council does not consider them binding on the Sheffields. And at the same time, the assent still, from this point, binds the Sheffields. Is that correct? Please,
Yeah, just to clarify and expand on that. My motion is to declare that the enforcement action, and I think it's just the 2022 action, is not effective against the Sheffields because they did not have actual or constructive notice of the assent at the time that they were cited. That's the first part of my motion. And then the second part is, as Ms. Hall said, you've said that the assent is still valid and in full force.
And that's based on the testimony provided by, I know you already said that.
Yeah, what I said before.
Mr. Gagnon.
Is there still any non-compliance with the enforcement order?
The first cease and desist order was issued for the structures, and once they were removed, that was resolved. We issued the second one because access was being blocked. I don't know if people are being told they can't walk there or not. I know that as far as I know, there's no structures there blocking access.
Well, if they are in compliance with what was ordered, could we just say that it's now in compliance and there's no further need for an enforcement action at this time?
I don't really know because there's the siren, there's the other stuff, and we haven't really talked about those issues.
And if I can add, are those cease and desist recorded land evidence records?
These are, no, we did not record. These.
Okay. Because that would be another extra aspect that would have to be basically invalidated through the land evidence records. But that's not the case, so we don't have to worry about it.
We did stop getting calls that access was being blocked. So when there was a security guard there, we were getting calls that people were being told they couldn't cross the property. We haven't been getting those, but I don't know for sure. Because unless you're there every day.
Any further discussion? All right, we have a motion that's been made and seconded. I will now pull the council. Mr. Russolino?
Aye.
Ms. Hall?
No.
Mr. Gagnon?
Aye.
Ms. Reynolds?
No.
Mr. Flynn?
Aye.
Mr. Izzy?
Aye.
I too vote aye. Did I cut the vote? Was it 5-2? 5-2. All right, thank you. Anything else? Having nothing else to come before the council, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn, which was made. Is there a second? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.